Welcome to Savage Harry. Today's adventure: what if Harry Potter was Aizen's reincarnation? Deceived Dumbledore for 11 years straight. If you haven't already, smash that subscribe button and ring the bell so you never miss a story. Now let's begin. Chapter 1. The cupboard under the stairs. Death, in his experience, had three textures. The first was the cold of the cell beneath the central 46 chamber, the cold of a verdict pretending to be a sentence. The second was the heat that came at the end, a light that ran through him on its way somewhere more important. The third was this, a sound he could not place, and a body that was not the body he had finished. The sound was breathing, small, regular, very fast. The body was 4 kilograms of bone and infant softness, lungs the size of plums, a heartbeat that had been beating without permission for what some part of him calculated as 14 months. He noticed this in the order of things he had been trained to notice. Threat first, then resources, then names. The threat stood in the doorway. A tall man in a black cloak, a thin face arranged in the particular pleasure of someone who has come a long way to do a small thing well. The wand was already raised. The mouth was already shaping the syllables. Beyond the man, a corridor, a stairway, a body at the foot of the stairway in robes that had once been good. Further down the corridor, a second body, a woman with red hair against pale wood, eyes open and untenanted. The thing that had been Sosuke Aizen, 3 minutes into its second life, took an exhaustive inventory and found that the most useful tool it had brought through the door of death was the one it had never learned to put down. Perception is a habit. His perception was not the perception of ordinary eyes. It was a thing he had built, sharpened, refined, and finally fused so deeply into the architecture of his cognition that it no longer required his consent. The hypnosis ran the way a heart runs. It was running now, on the breathing of a body that had been a stranger to him until the moment it became his. The man in the doorway said the word. The light that followed was the same green he had once watched bloom inside 1,000 carefully chosen test subjects. The light traveled the length of the room. It met the small forehead it had been aimed at, and it met something else, something that had no name in any of the languages spoken in this house. The light bent. It did not bend in the way a beam bends through glass. It bent in the way a sentence bends when the word at its center is not the word the speaker meant. The man in the doorway, who had spent decades teaching curses to fear him, watched his own curse arrive at the wrong place. It struck the wall behind the crib, then it struck him. Then a sound that was not the room and not the man came apart along an axis that had nothing to do with geometry. The thin face dissolved. Robes settled empty. Somewhere very far away, a thing that was a fragment of a man began the long crawl toward the next available body. In the crib, the small body shuddered with the perfect surprise of an infant who has been startled. Above the small body, behind eyes that could not yet focus, a being older than the country this house stood in finished its inventory. Threat removed. Resources. A body 14 months old in a house that had just lost its other inhabitants. A wand somewhere in the kitchen, the woman's. A man on the stairs who would never use his again. A scar on the forehead of this borrowed body that hummed at the edge of his attention like a pinned insect. Names. Sosuke, retired. The cot's blanket was embroidered with 3 letters. HJP. He read them once and decided. The infant began to cry, because the infant had been crying when he arrived, and because nothing should change too quickly. There were several things he could have done in the first hour. He could have walked out of the crib on legs he could borrow from the body's nascent reflexes. He could have removed the necessary memories from the half-circle of witnesses who would soon begin to arrive. He could have selected, from among the rural lanes outside the window, a household with the resources to raise an asset of his caliber properly. He did none of these. Patience had served him for centuries. There was no reason to abandon it for a body that could not yet lift its own head. He waited. The night thickened, voices in the lane, boots on broken plaster. A very large man in a leather coat, weeping into a beard the size of an apron, lifted him out of the crib with hands that smelled of pipe smoke and wet wool. The very large man said his name and apologized for being late. The infant cried in the appropriate register and was held against a chest that thumped like a kettle drum. Across the room, more figures arrived, robed, wand light flickering. He observed. He noted faces. The faces went into the same drawer that had once held the faces of his lieutenants in another life. The drawer was patient. It had room. A motorcycle rose over the broken roof. It was the most absurd vehicle he had been transported in for a very long time, and the indignity should have meant something to him. It meant nothing. The cold air over the Welsh hills cleared his small lungs. The very large man kept weeping. Below them somewhere, a country wept too, in pubs and parlors and kitchens, for a child whose mother had spent her last minute building a circuit out of love. He recognized the circuit. It had wrapped around him at the moment the green light arrived, and it had not quite been needed, but it had settled into the body anyway, the way a stranger's coat settles over the shoulders of a man already wearing one. A second skin. A second alibi. He filed it carefully. The motorcycle landed in Surrey at 3 in the morning. Privet Drive smelled of cut grass and chlorine. The very large man set him on a doorstep, tucked a letter into his blanket, kissed his forehead with surprising gentleness, and went away crying. An older man in half-moon spectacles arrived to perform a small ceremony of arrival, said a word over the blanket that any decent caster would have recognized as a blood bind, and went away with the air of a man finishing the second move of a long game. The infant on the doorstep let himself sleep for 2 hours, because sleeping was what was expected. When the door of number 4 opened in the morning, and a woman with a long neck shrieked, the infant cried on cue. He was lifted again by hands that did not love him, and held at arm's length while a man with a mustache decided which cupboard would do. It was not, in the end, an unfamiliar arrangement. He had spent a portion of his previous life living among people who hated what they did not understand. The Dursleys did not require any particular technique. He gave them the only stimulus their pattern recognized, a child who was small and odd and unloved, and they responded with the satisfaction of completing a known sentence. By 2, he could walk. He walked into walls. He fell into walls. He laughed when struck, because laughing when struck was the appropriate response if the goal was to be struck less and observed more. By 3, the Dursley pattern had stabilized. The cupboard under the stairs was 4 feet by 8, smelled of dust and detergent, and contained a single bear bulb and a spider that he watched for 3 weeks before deciding it had nothing to teach him. He let it live anyway. It was at 3 that the test came. Vernon had been drinking. Vernon, in his cups, was a man whose anger had a single direction. He pulled the small body out of the cupboard by the upper arm and shouted, in the bass register of a man rehearsing for a part he loved, that the rose bushes had been disturbed and someone would have to pay for them. The belt came off the loop in a single movement. Petunia, behind him, looked through the doorway without speaking. Dudley, in the kitchen, ate. The being inside the small body considered. 3 lives against 1 practice session. Vernon's neck, the long ridge of cartilage and habitual breath, would yield under no more pressure than a child could apply with a forefinger, if the child had access to the precise nerve cluster 3 centimeters below the jaw. Petunia's eyes, the eyes that had been looking through that doorway for 2 years now without acknowledging what stood in it, would not need to be touched. Petunia's mind ran on a single rail. The rail could be diverted at 3 points he had already mapped. Dudley was a child. He had never harmed a child for no reason. He did not intend to start now. So not 3 lives, 2. He weighed the 2 against the alternative. The alternative was patience. The alternative was 8 more years of cupboards, of overcooked breakfasts, of cruel cousins and indifferent aunts, and a man who would shout less as he grew larger and louder. The alternative was Hogwarts. The alternative was a school he had read 3 letters about, in the days when his small body could read by the light of the bulb after the household slept, when he tested the room's privacy by listening to the rhythms of the households breathing through the floorboards. The alternative was a country whose magical structure he had spent the past 3 years sketching in his head from overheard radio, and the gossip of a neighborhood that was, in some ways, the most informative source he had ever lived among. The alternative was the long game. He had not, in his previous life, chosen the long game out of fondness. He had chosen it because it produced larger margins. The margin here was a country full of wizards, a school full of children whose minds were unguarded, a hidden war that had paused but would not stay paused, and one old man with half-moon spectacles who had personally placed this body on this doorstep, and who would expect, in 11 years, to take delivery of the harvest. He let the belt fall. He cried in the high register that Vernon liked best. He apologized for the rose bushes he had not touched. He went into the cupboard with welts on the back of his thighs, and a small smile that no human had ever seen, and no human in this lifetime would. In the dark of the cupboard, he flexed 2 fingers along the seam of his palm in a sequence he had not performed in 3 years. The sequence had no effect because the small body had no spiritual pressure to channel. The sequence was rehearsal. The hands remembered. The hands were patient too. The spider got a name. He did not give the spider the name out loud. He gave it the name the way a man gives a name to a piece of equipment he expects to outlive him. The cupboard's bulb burnt out twice between his 4th and 6th birthday. The first time, he replaced it with the spare in the kitchen drawer. Petunia noticed, did not ask, and recounted the spare bulbs the next time she shopped. The second time, he read by the slat of light under the door for 3 weeks until Vernon noticed his eyes were sharper than they had been and shouted, less from concern than from a sense that the boy should not be allowed advantages. By 6, he had read every book in the house. There were not many. A volume on knot tying, a Reader's Digest condensed novel about a woman who left her husband, an annotated copy of an Agatha Christie that Vernon had received as a gag gift, and 3 children's encyclopedias of the kind sold door to door by men in mustard-colored suits. He absorbed the encyclopedias. He found the chapter on parliamentary government less informative than the chapter on the digestive systems of insects. He liked the insects. He could see in the insects the architectures he had built before. By 7, he had begun to draw, on the back of grocery receipts retrieved from the bin and smoothed flat on the cupboard floor, a map of the household's behavior. He noted the days Vernon was likeliest to drink, the hours Petunia spoke to her sister-in-law on the phone, the precise minute Dudley returned from school each weekday, the seasonal cycles of the neighborhood's gossip. The map was for practice, because his hands required practice in the medium of pencils, and the medium of pencils was what was available. The map was also for accuracy, because accuracy was the discipline he had carried out of the cell beneath the central 46 chamber and would not be putting down. By 8, he had performed his first piece of inadvertent magic, because the small body's nervous system had begun to leak spiritual pressure that had no proper channel, and a teacher's wig had turned blue. The wig incident was a useful data point. It meant the body was assembling its own infrastructure, and the infrastructure would arrive on schedule. He was careful after the wig to be cautious about feelings the body produced. The body produced feelings. The mind that lived above the body filtered them. The filter was the same filter that had once kept him from laughing in a chamber full of captains. The filter was patient too. By 9, he was sometimes lonely. This surprised him. He filed the surprise without comment. At 10, the Dursleys took him with them to a service station on the M25 to spare themselves the indignity of hiring a sitter for a relation they could not bear to leave in the house unobserved. He sat in the back of the car with his hands folded and watched the country pass at 60 miles an hour. England was, in its small gray way, beautiful. He had not, in his previous life, had much occasion to think of beauty. The previous life had been spent largely indoors, and the indoors had been the indoors of a place where every wall meant something. Here outside, the walls meant nothing, and a hedge with a kestrel on it could be a hedge with a kestrel on it and require no further reading. He chose, in the back of the car, to permit the small body 1 full minute of looking. The looking was, in the technical sense, a wasted minute. He logged the waste. He decided he could afford it occasionally. The letters arrived on his 11th birthday. He had been waiting for them. He had known, more or less, when they would come. He had read enough chimney soot residue from the late evening returns of the family owls of 2 of his Privet Drive neighbors, a family that had not, in fact, been muggle, though they had hidden it well, to be sure that the school was real, that it took children at 11, and that his particular profile had certainly been on a list since he had set foot in the cupboard. He had also known the household would not let him have one. The household was constituted to deny him things he wanted. The household, in this case, was working in his favor. The household made the school's intervention inevitable, and the inevitability made the intervention legible to the school as a rescue. Rescues built loyalty. He did not require loyalty from the school. He preferred to have it on offer. The first letter came on Tuesday. Vernon burnt it. The second letter came on Wednesday. Vernon ate his breakfast standing up. By Sunday, letters were coming through the milk crates and the spaces between the floorboards and once, memorably, out of an egg. He played the role of the bewildered child, whose existence was being acknowledged at last by a world he had not previously visited. He widened his eyes at the address. Mr. H. Potter, the cupboard under the stairs. He let his mouth fall open. He stammered the night the egg cracked that he didn't know what it meant. Petunia knew what it meant and would not say. Vernon knew that the only thing left was to run. The hut on the rock was, as a piece of theater, well staged. He admired the staging. The rain on the roof, the cold under the door, the half-stale cake Petunia had bought because she had not been able to bring herself to bake one. The clock ticked toward midnight. Outside, the sea churned. The door of the hut shuddered, then fell off its hinges as though gravity had personally taken offense. The very large man from the night he had arrived in this country came through the doorway, shook the door's frame to make sure it stayed open, and said, "You're a wizard, Harry." He held the stammer 1 beat longer than necessary because the stammer would be expected, and an audience trained to expect a stammer was an audience that received nothing they had not asked for. SS sorry. The leaky cauldron, when Hagrid pushed open the door at the end of an alley between a record shop and a bookshop, that none of the Muggle pedestrians on Charing Cross Road appeared to be seeing, was the most informative single room he had walked into during his 11 years. The room smelled of pipe smoke and old beer, and the faint herbal residue of the pub's house draft. A dozen patrons were drinking at a dozen small tables. He noted, in the pass he had made on entering, the location of each patron, the cut of their robes, the wandarm of those whose wandarm was visible, the small unconscious gestures by which each of them had been carrying the weight of the war they had concluded 11 autumns ago. A wizard in fox fur at the bar was missing 2 fingers on his left hand. A witch in the corner had a small badge that he placed, on memory, as a junior auror's pin from the spring before he had been born. A man in black with the look of a clerk had been writing in the same ledger for 9 minutes without making a fresh mark. Tom, the barman behind the bar, dropped the glass he was polishing into the basin and came around at a speed Tom, the barman, had not previously achieved. "Bless my soul," said Tom. "Bless my soul, it's Harry Potter, bless my soul." The room turned in a single coordinated motion. He had read, in the previous 9 years, perhaps 30 accounts of the public turning toward a single object of attention. 40 seconds and the room had emptied of its private occupations. The man with 2 fingers came over and shook his small hand and said something. The junior orer, who was no longer junior, came over and said something. The clerk came over, set his ledger to one side, and bowed. A nervous man in a turban came over also. The man stammered, "H. Harry P. Potter, can't tell you how pleased I am to meet you." The being inside the small body filed the turban. The being filed the stammer. The being filed, in the order he had been trained to file these things, the presence behind the turban that he had no apparatus to detect at 11, but the absence of which was, on close attention, conspicuous. The man in the turban gave off a small pressure that no other person in the room was giving off, the small pressure of a person whose tissue had been recently inhabited by something it was not made to hold. "Pleased to meet you too," he said. "Professor Quirrell will be one of your teachers at Hogwarts," said Hagrid. "What subject, Professor?" "D.D. Defense against the D.D. Dark Arts." The smile he gave Professor Quirrell in the moment of the answer was the smile of a boy whose vocabulary did not yet include the term irony. He held the smile for the correct interval. Hagrid steered him toward the back. The back of the leaky cauldron opened onto a small walled yard with a dustbin in it. Hagrid raised his pink umbrella to the brick wall, counted up 3 and across 2, and tapped. The bricks remembered their function. They flowed away from each other in the elegant accordion he had seen, in the past 9 years, 3 accounts of, all of them less precise than the bricks themselves. The alley opened. Diagon Alley was a long, crooked street that ran on a charm older than the modern wand industry. Cauldron shops. An apothecary whose window was a study in legal gray ingredient classifications. Dried billywig stings, beetle eyes in jars, things in jars he had read about in the second textbook Hagrid had bought him. A magical menagerie with 3 cats in the window, a tank of double-ended newts, and a rack of Krupp puppies. A robe shop. A bookshop in which the window display was a single book that read aloud from itself in 3 voices arranged in a low chord. The shop fronts were each individually charming. The street itself was the charm. He noted in his pass the placements that would matter. The Daily Prophet's offices, 3 blocks down, set in the building whose front had been rebuilt in 1981 in a slightly different stone than the building beside it. Ollivander's, halfway down. Quality Quidditch Supplies, 2/3 of the way down, with a display window in which 7 boys his own age were standing with their faces pressed to the glass. The entrance to Nocturne Alley, in the gap between an auction house and a closed-down haberdasher's, marked with no sign because the sign would have been redundant. Anyone who needed Nocturne Alley already knew where it was. The flu registration office, set in a glass-fronted booth at the western end. Gringotts at the eastern end, white marble, taller than the other buildings, gleaming. He spent 90 seconds looking at it all. He let Hagrid mistake the looking for the small wonder Hagrid had been waiting all morning to see produced on his face. He gave Hagrid the wonder. Hagrid wept again. The goblin at the Gringotts counter in the marbled hall was a creature whose calligraphy ran left to right at a slope of 12 degrees, and whose eyes had been doing inventory of the small body since he had come through the door. The goblin asked Hagrid for the key. Hagrid produced the key. The goblin examined the key with the dry economy of an institution that had been examining keys for centuries. The goblin pressed a small bell. Another goblin came to lead them to the carts. The carts. The descent into the marble. The cold air over the running track of the underbank. The vault that contained the Potter fortunes opened at the press of the goblin's finger, which the goblin's finger had been pressing for 60 years. He stepped inside. The vault contained 16 feet by 16 feet of gold and silver and bronze coins, arranged in the loose drifts that meant the family had not, in the last decade, sent anyone in to count it. He took, in his cousin's hand-me-down pocket, exactly the amount of money the school's list of supplies would require, plus a small additional sum for a meal, plus the tip Hagrid would later refuse. He did not take more. Taking more would have read, the school's accounting had a way of speaking to itself about overwithdrawals, and he had calculated that the audience for the overwithdrawal would have been a clerk in a small office in the 6th-floor records department who would have spent 40 minutes telling the next office over about it. The second vault was Hagrid's errand. He was instructed by Hagrid with great seriousness not to look. He did not look. He noticed, in the half-second the door of the second vault was open, that the air over the threshold had the precise barometric instability he had once encountered in the chamber where his own previous body had been laid for the night before the trial. The instability was the small kind of pressure a single highly bound object produced when it was the only object in a vault that was large enough to contain 6 others. He filed the instability. He filed the size of the parcel Hagrid wrapped in his great hand around the small object and tucked into the deep pocket of his moleskin coat. The carts came up. The marble lobby reasserted itself. Hagrid bought him a Cornish pasty at a stall outside. Madame Malkin's took 23 minutes. Madame Malkin was a fat little witch in mauve robes who took down his measurements with the brisk impatience of a tradeswoman with a queue building up at her door. The pale boy at the next stool, who would in 9 minutes turn out to be a Malfoy, made his opening pitch. He gave the pitch the small vacancy. The pale boy made his second pitch. He gave the second pitch the same. The pale boy made his third, which was an inquiry about his name. He gave only a small surname. He did not say Potter, he said Harry. The pale boy frowned, having lost the calibration he had been hoping the conversation would produce. The pale boy mentioned, with the casual cruelty of his class, that a friend of his father's had been at the Daily Prophet's office last week, and had heard that a certain absurd small boy was being expected this autumn. He gave the casual cruelty a small, uncertain nod. The pale boy looked at his forehead, did not see the scar Madame Malkin's hem had pulled the fringe up to obscure, and decided he did not have the evidence to risk the wager. He filed the pale boy for autumn. He paid Madame Malkin. He thanked her. He stepped out into the alley. Hagrid was waiting outside with an ice cream from Florian Fortescue's. The ice cream was strawberry and peanut butter, which was a combination no Surrey establishment had ever attempted, and which proved to be the correct combination, and which he ate with the small care of a child who had not, in 9 years, had access to a flavor of ice cream that was not the kind Petunia froze in plastic tubs from the supermarket. He thanked Hagrid. Hagrid wept again less, and asked him whether he wanted to go to the bookshop next or the apothecary next. He chose the bookshop. The bookshop was flourish and blots. The shelves climbed in a way that did not, on careful measurement, match the height of the ceiling. He bought the textbooks on the school's list. He also, with the small additional sum he had brought up from Gringotts, bought one additional book, Hogwarts, a history. He had read enough of Yvonne to know that the book would be a corroboration of the country he had assembled in his head, and that Hermione Granger, when he met her in 11 weeks, would have read it cover to cover, and that a boy who had read it cover to cover also would have a leg up he did not, on first principles, require but would not refuse if it was being offered. The apothecary's smells were professional. He bought his ingredients. The Aeolip's Owl Emporium had a single white snowy owl in the third cage from the door that was looking at him with the steady yellow regard of a creature that did not, perhaps, see what every other creature saw and was puzzled. Hagrid, who had been planning the gift for 9 years, paid for it and presented it to him on the cobbles outside. He produced the wonder. Hagrid produced more weeping. He thanked Hagrid in the small voice he had been thanking everyone in all morning. The owl in its cage swiveled its head 90 degrees and regarded him further. He named the owl in his head, in the second voice he had not used aloud in 11 years. Hedwig. It was a name from a book about a 10th century saint, which he had read on page 211 of Hogwarts, a history the previous afternoon. The school's history mentioned her. The school's history was the kind of source he could decorate his life from without leaving fingerprints. He spoke the name aloud, in the small body's voice with its stammer. H. Hedwig, he said. Hi. Hedwig made the small CHRR that meant she had registered the name and accepted it as her own. He went last to Ollivander's. The wand shop was the part he had been curious about. It was a small place that smelled of cedar and very old varnish. The shelves climbed in a way that defied the floor plan he had glimpsed from outside. The proprietor came out of the back without making a noise, which was unusual. Very few men in this country had learned to walk without making a noise. The proprietor's eyes were the color of moonstone. They looked at him for slightly too long. I wondered when I would be seeing you, Mr. Potter. The voice was gentle and not gentle at all. He let the small face produce a tentative smile. He let the small hand stay folded. The proprietor walked the length of the shelves, pulled boxes, offered wands. The first wand sent a draft through the room that knocked over a saucer. The second sent a faint ozone smell up from the floor. The third, when his hand closed around it, did something he had not expected. 11 inches, holly, phoenix feather. The wand warmed in his palm to the precise temperature of his pulse. The light that ran out of its tip was not theater, it was a recognition, the way water meets water. The being who had taken up residence in this body noticed 2 things in the same instant. The first was that the wand was a real tool, of the sort he had not had since the cell, and the absence of which he had not previously noticed, because he had not let himself notice. The second was that Ollivander said, in the gentle voice that wasn't, curious that you should be destined for this wand when its brother gave you that scar. He held the smile. He let the small head tilt a careful 17 degrees. He let the small voice say, sorry, sir. Ollivander's pale eyes did not leave him. The eyes looked through the smile and through the careful tilt, and through every layer he had built and found, where the layers ended, what they were meant to find. A small frightened boy who had only just discovered he was a wizard, who did not yet understand that wands had brothers, who had a scar he had not asked for and a future he could not name. The eyes found this boy because that was the only boy the perception in the room could permit them to find. Ollivander saw a child. Ollivander always saw a child. Ollivander would always see, when he looked at this customer, the child this customer had built for him. The proprietor nodded slowly and packaged the wand in brown paper. Outside, on the cobbles, the very large man bought him an owl as a birthday present and wept again, briefly, because the very large man wept on the slightest provocation. He carried the owl in its cage. The owl, in its cage, regarded him with the steady yellow regard of a creature that did not, perhaps, see what every other creature saw and was puzzled. He looked at the owl and decided that the owl also was a useful resource, and that he would name it something soft so that the household around it would not suspect. The train was leaving on the 1st of September. He had 9 weeks. He spent the 9 weeks in the cupboard, reading the school books Hagrid had bought him by the light of the bulb, replacing the bulb when it burnt out and waiting. By the eve of departure, he had read every textbook 3 times, memorized the index of each, mapped the historical record of the school against the political record of the country, identified 17 probable points where his presence at the school would be useful to the man with half-moon spectacles, and chosen the order in which he would permit those points to be activated. He had not yet decided which house he would request. He had a preference. He had not committed. On the morning of the 1st of September, Vernon drove him to King's Cross because Petunia had insisted, with a face like a cold pudding, that the boy was no longer their problem and could be dropped at the curb. Vernon laughed on the curb at the platform number on the ticket, 9 3/4. He laughed too loudly. He drove away. The small body stood on the curb with a trunk it could barely lift, an owl in a cage it had not named yet, and the brown paper-wrapped wand inside the breast pocket of a cousin's hand-me-down jacket. The being who lived in the small body looked at the great glass arch of the station and noticed, for the second time in this lifetime, that England was, in its small gray way, beautiful. He permitted the small body 1 full minute of looking. He logged the waste. He went inside. Chapter 1 and Chapter 2, the sorting. The barrier between platforms 9 and 10 did not look like a barrier. It looked like a brick wall behind a luggage trolley, with a sign that did not invite scrutiny, and a thin family of red-haired travelers loitering near it in the practiced posture of people who were waiting to be observed. He stood near the sandwich kiosk and watched the family for 90 seconds. The mother was a small, round woman with eyes that took inventory and passes. She had counted her children 3 times in the last minute, and she was off by 1, because the oldest was already on the other side. The girl, 6 or 7, wanted to go to school and was speaking to no one about it. The twins were a unit, identical, perfectly synchronized. The youngest boy was a fraction taller than the small body that was attending him, freckled, doomed by a hand-me-down jumper, and obviously hoping to be noticed. He let the boy notice him. He picked up the trolley, which he could only just manage, and walked toward the family with the studied uncertainty of a child whose adults had failed him at the curb. The small, round woman saw him at 6 paces, performed the inventory pass that had been failing her for the last minute, and her face arranged itself into the precise sympathy that resolved her count. "Hello, dear, first time at Hogwarts," he performed the stammer. He let his eyes go to the barrier, then to the boy with the freckles, then back. He nodded. "Ron's new too. All you have to do is walk straight at the wall there between platforms 9 and 10. Best do it at a bit of a run if you're nervous." He ran. The wall did not, in the technical sense, exist. The wall was a courtesy extended to the railway authority. He was on the other side in 3 strides. The Scarlet Engine on the other side was the most public theater he had walked into in 2 lifetimes, and he liked it. He liked the white-blue smoke. He liked the brass nameplate. He liked, especially, the volume of 1,000 children rehearsing the year's first goodbye. Volume was cover. Volume was the most efficient cloak there was. He lifted his trunk into a compartment with help he did not need from the freckled boy, whose name had now been said 3 times in his hearing. "Mind if I sit?" said Ron Weasley. Not at all," he said, and Ron Weasley sat. The train pulled out of King's Cross at 11 on the dot. England slid sideways into hedges and small gray towns. Ron Weasley told him, between bites of a corned beef sandwich, the names of all his brothers, the disposition of all his brothers, the names of the family owls, the names of the family rats, the score of 3 Quidditch matches he had watched in the previous summer, the names of 3 Quidditch teams he had not watched, and the precise position on the cannon's roster that he intended to occupy in adulthood. The being who lived in the small body filed it all without effort. He had developed his memory in a place where forgetting had cost lives. A boy's autobiography was not a stretch. The food trolley came. He bought everything on it because he had money, and because Ron Weasley had brought sandwiches that even Ron Weasley did not want to eat. He shared. Ron Weasley shared also in the way of small boys who had not been treated kindly enough to expect kindness in return, with disbelief, then gratitude, then the loud loyalty of a creature whose loyalty was the easiest of his possessions to give away. A boy with a toad knocked. Then a girl. The girl was a calibration he had been waiting for. She came into the compartment with the kind of forward stance that had been carried, for a generation in this country, by the kind of student who already suspected that the institutions were not as serious as they had been told the institutions were. Her hair was the hair of a young person who had not yet been persuaded to brush it more than once a day. Her eyes were brown and quick. She introduced herself in the same paragraph as her family, the first witch in my family. Can you believe it? Her academic preparation. I've learned all the set books off by heart, of course. And her view on the toad situation. Has anyone seen one? A boy named Neville's lost it. He let his face do the appropriate things. Harry, he said. She looked at his forehead. He let his fringe stay where it was. She filed the look away in a face that announced what it filed. Harry Potter, she said. I know all about you. I've got a few books and you're in modern magical history and the rise and fall of the dark arts and great wizarding events of the 20th century. He let his eyes widen the appropriate distance. He let his hands do something useless. With the corner of a chocolate frog wrapper, he stammered something polite about not knowing he was in books, which Ron Weasley confirmed with a snort that he was, and Hermione Granger filed his stammer in the same face that had filed the look. He noticed the filing. He marked, very privately, the second cell of a new ledger. A pale boy with a pointed face knocked on the compartment glass and slid the door back without asking. Two larger boys filled the doorway behind him, doing the work of menace in a register the pale boy had clearly directed. They're saying all down the train that Harry Potter's in this compartment. He let the small face produce the expression he had been giving the audience all morning, polite, slightly bewildered, with a hint that whoever was speaking had said something the speaker would have to repeat. The pale boy repeated his name. The pale boy offered, by way of credentials, his own. I'm Malfoy, Draco Malfoy. Ron Weasley snorted. Draco Malfoy explained with the gentle confidence of a child reciting a creed who his friends ought to be. He extended a hand. The being inside the small body considered the hand. Two things were true at once. The first was that Draco Malfoy was, in his current configuration, useless. A child with no skills he could not buy, no information he had not already heard from his parents, and no insight he could not have been talked out of with 20 minutes and a sufficient pause. The second was that Draco Malfoy was, in 8 years, going to be a man with access to rooms his father owned, names his father trusted, and the precise hangers on his father had assembled to outlive his political career. The 8-year man would be useful. The 11-year man was a courtesy at best, and a courtesy paid to Draco Malfoy now would be a debt 8 years from now. He did not take the hand. He gave Draco Malfoy his most apologetic stammer, and an answer that fit canon. He could tell the wrong sort for himself, thanks. Ron Weasley shone with vindicated pride. Draco Malfoy's face did the thing pale faces do when blood goes the other way. The two larger boys swung into the compartment, took a half-step forward and stopped because Ron Weasley's rat, which the boy had explained 10 minutes ago was old and useless, had launched off Ron Weasley's knee in a sudden interest in the largest boy's hand, and the largest boy had recoiled. The pale boy left. The two larger boys followed. Hermione Granger, who had been standing in the corridor without admitting it, came back in and pointed out that they would arrive in 10 minutes and ought to put on their robes. Ron Weasley said something about her. The being who lived in the small body filed Ron Weasley's word and did not return it. He pulled on his school robe over the cousin's hand-me-down jacket. He glanced once in the compartment glass at the boy looking back. The boy looking back was, by every measure he had access to, perfect. The boats waited on the shore in a fleet of small, flat-bottomed craft, each big enough for 4 students. He stepped into one beside Ron Weasley, Hermione Granger, and a small, round-faced boy called Neville Longbottom, who was carrying a toad in his cupped hands as though the toad were a bomb. The boats moved without paddles. He watched the wake the boats produced on the water. The wake was the precise narrow V of a craft displacing less weight than the craft visibly displaced. The spell that propelled them was an old one, charm and buoyancy. The kind of spell a 4th-year charm student could have replicated with adequate motivation, but which only a school of 900 years could have maintained without revision. He admired the maintenance. He turned the small face up toward the castle, which rose on the far side of the lake, out of a black cliff like a single object that had been carved by the cliff and then balanced on it. Hermione Granger beside him was telling Neville Longbottom, in a voice she had been calibrating all evening, about Hogwarts, a history. Neville Longbottom was nodding. The toad was sitting in his hands without complaint. Ron Weasley in the bow was leaning so far over the water that the boat's wake had begun to swing. He gripped Ron Weasley's elbow with the small body's small fingers. He pulled him back. "Steady on," he said. "Sorry," said Ron. "I just look at it." The castle had a great gate that opened, when the boats came into the boathouse, on a charm-keyed servant of the castle. The servant was the witch in green robes from the platform. She inspected them with the careful inventory of a teacher whose first task each year had been to estimate, by passing eye, the shape of the new cohort. Her eye went down the line. It paused at Hermione Granger. It paused at Ron Weasley. It paused at him. He gave her the small uncertainty of a boy who had been carried across a lake. She filed him. She led them up a winding staircase, into the antechamber off the great hall. The antechamber smelled of beeswax and old stone. McGonagall stood at the front of the crowd. She spoke for the precise interval that the audience could absorb. She told them about the 4 houses, about the points, about the cup. She told them they would be sorted in a few minutes. She left. The first-years began to whisper. He let the small body listen. The whispers were a study in cohort composition. 2 of the children were trying not to cry. 3 were boasting about brothers in particular houses. With the small braggadocio of children who had been raised on a single subject. A boy with a freckled face 2 rows over was conferring with another boy who looked exactly like him, except that the freckled boy on the left had a single small scar above the lip, where a wand tip had grazed him during a domestic dispute approximately 70 days ago. He filed the scar. A girl with very pale hair was wearing a ring that had a small enchantment on it. He filed the ring. Hermione Granger behind him was muttering, in a voice that was perhaps not as low as she had meant it to be, the 4-stanza song the Sorting Hat would in a moment sing, which she had memorized from Hogwarts, a history. He filed the muttering. Ron Weasley beside him looked, for the first half-second of the antechamber, as though the antechamber's pressure had hit him harder than the boats had. He gave Ron a small, encouraging glance, and Ron took it. A row of small gray figures glided through the back wall. Ghosts. He had read about the ghosts. He had not, on his planning, expected to find them charming. He found them, on first encounter, charming. The fat friar nodded at him. Sir Nicholas waved. A small, plumply transparent monk apologized to a witch in graying robes whose name, he had reviewed in his textbook the previous month, was the Gray Lady. He nodded back. He had been raised in the cultures of beings without bodies. He could afford the courtesy. McGonagall returned. She formed them into a line. The doors opened. The Great Hall was the most theatrically successful single chamber he had been in during either of his lives. He let the small face do the appropriate widening. He took, with the small body's eyes, the 4 long tables, the candles floating in the air above them, the staff table at the front, the ceiling that opened on the night sky. The ceiling, he had read, was charmed to reflect the weather outside the castle. The reflection was excellent. A small bank of cloud on the eastern horizon was, on close attention, 3 minutes ahead of the actual horizon because the spell ran its reflection through a buffer to allow the ceiling time to render. He filed the buffer. He filed the 4 staff members who would matter. The witch in green robes, dependable. The half-giant, loyal beyond use. The greasy-haired man in black who sat behind the salt cellar and would not let his eyes leave the new students. The most interesting face in the room, and in the great seat at the center, the old man with half-moon spectacles, who looked at the assembled first years with the gentle, very particular pleasure of a chess player who has just been brought a fresh board. He did not let his eyes meet the old man's. Not yet. The eye contact would come at a moment he chose. The moment was not now. The Sorting Hat was older than the statute of secrecy and approximately as honest. The hat was set on a stool at the front of the hall. It opened a tear along its brim and sang a song, in a voice like a worn-out cello, about the 4 founders and the 4 houses and the long discipline of choice. He listened. He admired the song. The song was, in the way of all useful songs, more information than the singer realized. Names were called. Children went up, sat under the brim, and were sorted in seconds. He observed the times. The fastest sorting was 4 seconds Crab V into Slytherin. The slowest was a girl named Susan Bones who took 31 seconds. The hat was deliberating with her, the way one deliberates with a difficult colleague. Potter, Harry. The hall did the small wave of breath he had been expecting. He let his small face do bewildered. He walked to the stool. He sat. The hat came down over his eyes. There was a pause. The pause was the longest pause that had been measured under that brim in 3 centuries. The hat said, very quietly in a voice that was inside him and not inside him, "Oh." He did not move. "You are not a boy." He did not move. "You are not even, in the strictest accounting, a person of this country. You are a memory. You are several memories. You are a hand-built thing, very fine, that has elected to live behind a face I have been asked to sort. I have sorted 3 founders, 2 reformers, 53 aurors, and 1 minister. I have not, in my history, been asked to sort a guest of this kind." He let, behind the small face, a very small acknowledgement. "I see what you are doing. I see what you intend to do. I see what you have already done. I will say none of it because the oath of the Sorting Hat does not permit me to say any of it. You will find when you have finished my song that I am unfailingly discreet about my work." A small acknowledgement, polite. "I am only the hat. I do not punish. I do not reward. I sort. So tell me, traveler, where would you go?" The being inside the small body considered. The schemers in green would have taken him because he was their kind by every metric the hat was permitted to measure. They would have taught him nothing he did not know, surrounded him with allies whose loyalty was contingent, and whose intelligence was bounded by the prejudices of their parents, and they would have positioned him, for the next 7 years, in a way that announced his location to every adversary in the country. The clever in blue would have offered him better books and worse cover. The fair in yellow would have given him a constituency that could not be turned to his ends without ruining the constituency. The brave in red were, by reputation, brash, headstrong, and indiscriminately welcoming. They were exactly the cover he intended to wear. He gave the hat the answer. "Better be," the hat said aloud in a voice that climbed back to the cello. "Gryffindor." The table on the left exploded. Twin redheads bellowed his name. Ron Weasley's freckled face split. Hermione Granger, 2 minutes earlier sorted into the same house, did the small private smile of a person who had been hoping for an outcome and had been too disciplined to admit it. He took the hat off, set it on the stool, walked to his table, and sat with his eyes lowered. He let the small face look up only when the next name was called. At the high table, the old man with half-moon spectacles had been watching him from the moment the hat went on. The old man had not looked away once. The old man was still looking. The old man's gentle, very particular pleasure had been replaced, for a fraction of a second, by something that was not pleasure. A small wrinkle on the surface of an old pond, that came when a stone had been thrown a long way off and the wave had finally arrived. He let the small face return the old man's gaze and added to the gaze the bewildered glow of a boy who has just been welcomed into a hall he had not believed he would ever be allowed into. The old man smiled. The wrinkle closed. The pond resumed. He filed the wrinkle. The welcome feast was loud. He ate a small portion of everything within reach, because eating a small portion of everything within reach was what an undernourished 11-year-old would do, and because he had not, in some weeks, had access to the kind of food this hall produced in industrial quantity. He listened to Ron Weasley itemize his brother's Quidditch records again, with an enthusiasm that was, on the third pass, almost charming. He observed the staff table over the rim of his goblet. A pale-faced man in black, who had not yet looked away from him since the sorting, was sitting beside a man in a purple turban who twitched every 12 to 14 seconds in a way that announced something parasitic about the back of his skull. The pale-faced man was Professor Snape. He had read the name in the school's prospectus 3 weeks ago and confirmed it with the witch in green robes on the way in. The pale-faced man's eyes were dark and very still. The pale-faced man was, at this exact instant, performing a small surgical reach into the air across the hall, the kind of reach a Legilimens performs when the target is too far away for proper work, but the reacher cannot help himself. The being inside the small body did not block the reach. Blocking would have signaled. Blocking would have produced, in a man as paranoid as the man in black, the certainty that there was something here to be reached for. He let the reach arrive. What the reach met was a small, frightened boy who had grown up in a cupboard, who had been startled this morning by a barrier that ran into the platform, who had been touched on the shoulder by a girl who knew his name from books, and who was, at this moment, eating shepherd's pie too fast because there was a finite amount of it and he had not been certain in his cupboard years of the next meal. The boy's mind had no special doors. The boy's mind had no secrets that required hiding. The boy's surface was honest, complete, and on the surface, and the surface was the only thing the reach was equipped to read. The pale-faced man's eyes narrowed by a degree because the surface had been a fraction too smooth, the way the surface of a still pond is a fraction too smooth when a fish is sitting on the bottom of it. The pale-faced man's reach withdrew. The pale-faced man took a sip of pumpkin juice with the deliberation of a man who had been about to say something and had decided not to. Across the hall, the small body finished its pie. 2 doors down, the man in the purple turban twitched. The being inside the small body, who had been listening to the turban with one of the senses he could not yet fully access in this lifetime, registered a kind of presence the small body had no analog for. The turban contained, riding on the back of the man's skull, a passenger who was a very small, very damaged copy of the man whose curse had passed through his crib 11 years ago. The passenger was hungry. The passenger was confused. The passenger had been told by someone, or had decided, that the boy across the hall would be a useful thing to either consume or recruit, and the passenger was at present unable to decide which. He filed the passenger. He decided, as a working hypothesis, that the passenger would be useful as a chaos agent until further notice. He decided that the chaos would be steered. He returned to his shepherd's pie. The prefect led the first years up several staircases, around a corner that did not stay where it had been when she went around it last, and to a portrait of a fat lady in a pink dress who demanded a password. He noted the password Caput Draconis, and the location of the 8 nearest portraits along the corridor and the precise sequence in which they would, if pressed, gossip about a student. The common room was warm. The dormitory was warmer. 5 four-poster beds stood in a circle, draped in scarlet, each with a trunk at its foot. Ron Weasley fell on his bed and asked, in the careful voice of a boy who is not quite sure of the etiquette, whether they should swap stories about their families. The being inside the small body sat on the edge of his own bed, untied his shoes with the deliberate awkwardness of a child unused to the kind of shoes that did not have hand-me-down knots in them, and gave Ron Weasley what Ron Weasley wanted. "I lived in a cupboard," he said, and he stammered the C because it was a C that wanted stammering. "They didn't really like me," Ron Weasley said, blimey, with the right note of horror and the right note of awe. The other 3 boys in the dormitory said variations on the same word. He let the small body very slightly lower its eyes. He let, on his way to the pillow, his mouth do one extremely small thing that no one in the room saw. Above him, the canopy of the 4-poster was the deep, rich red of velvet that had been brushed once a day for 900 years by an elf who took pride in his work. He looked up into it. He noted that the canopy, like the song, was more information than its makers had realized. He closed his eyes. In the great hall below them, the old man with half-moon spectacles was, at that moment, telling the deputy headmistress, in the calm voice of a man who was sharing a difficulty rather than a complaint, that he had seen something in the boys' sorting that he could not account for, and he would like, when there was an opportunity, to spend some time observing Mr. Potter at his lessons. Across the staff table, a man in a purple turban excused himself from supper and went, with a deliberate gait, in the direction of the 3rd-floor corridor that no student would, on pain of death, be entering this year. In a 4-poster in the boys' dormitory of Gryffindor Tower, a being older than the country slept the slow, accurate sleep of a man who has finished the first move of a long game and is exactly where he meant to be. He woke at 6 the following morning to the slow gray light of a Highland September coming through the dormitory's leaded windows. Ron Weasley was snoring in the next bed. The other 3 boys in the dormitory were asleep in the postures that meant they had not slept well. One was on his stomach with his face mashed into his pillow. The second was on his back with an arm dangling over the edge of the bed. The third was on his side with his pillow on the floor. He registered the postures. He registered the breathing rates. He registered the precise interval at which the fire in the dormitory grate had been crackling, which the dormitory house elves had been keeping at a low burn through the night. He sat up. He swung his legs out from under the scarlet quilt. He stood. He padded in bare feet to the leaded window, which gave him a view down across the courtyard, past the bell tower, to the lake and the forbidden forest beyond. The mist over the lake was a pale, unhurried thing. A small fishing boat, apparently unattended, was moving across the water at a slow drift that had no source he could identify. He filed the boat. The forest beyond the lake was an inky line. He let the small body have 90 seconds of looking. He budgeted the waste in advance. He turned away from the window and went, on bare feet, to his trunk. He took out a fresh set of robes. He took out his wand and laid it across the top of the trunk. He took out from beneath the second layer of clothes the copy of Hogwarts, a history he had bought at Flourish and Blots. He had read it 3 times over the holidays and had been rereading it on the train. He set it on the bedside table. He dressed. By 7, he had walked twice round the common room, taken inventory of every portrait on the walls of the corridor between the fat lady and the staircase, identified the squashy armchair that, by the small set of scuffs along its left arm, was the chair the previous year's seventh-year boys had been sitting in to write their NEWT revisions, and decided that he would, when the opportunity arose, take that chair as his own. He went to breakfast. The Great Hall at 7 on the 2nd of September was a third full. Most of the first years had not yet found their way down. Most of the older students were sleeping the additional half-hour the first morning of term allowed. He sat at the Gryffindor table beside one of the Weasley twins, whose first name he had filed but had not yet decided to use, and ate the precise amount of porridge a small recovering boy from a cupboard would eat. McGonagall came down the long table at 7:15 and gave the first years their timetables. He took his without looking at it. He had been expecting the timetable for a fortnight. He had read the year's curriculum on the train. He had a working sense of what was coming. The timetable confirmed it. Monday's Transfiguration, Tuesday's Potion, Wednesday's Charms, Thursday's Astronomy, Friday's Defense, with double history of magic on Thursday mornings and a single period of herbology twice a week. He folded the timetable into the inside pocket of his robe. He went after breakfast to his first class. His first lesson was History of Magic with Professor Binns. Professor Binns was a ghost. He had read about Professor Binns. Professor Binns had been alive once, had taught a single class on his last morning, had fallen asleep in the staff room, and had failed to take his body with him when he stood up to teach the next class. The ghost now droned through the syllabus of the last several centuries with a competence that the syllabus respected but the students did not. He listened, in the first lesson, with the attention he had been giving the radio in Petunia's kitchen during his Surrey years, the kind of attention that lay flat against the source and absorbed it. He took, at the end of the lesson, 6 pages of notes in a small, careful handwriting he had been refining over the past 2 weeks to resemble the handwriting of an 11-year-old boy who had not had much practice with a quill. Hermione Granger, 2 rows in front of him, took 11 pages of notes. She filed his 6 against her 11. The filing was the careful filing of a girl who had been told, by a small chapter of a history of magic, that the school's intake had typically produced 1 or 2 students per year who became, by the end of their 7 years, the very best in their year. She had been keeping notes on the small competition since the train. The notes had identified, in 3 weeks, 4 candidates for the very best in the year. The first was a Ravenclaw girl called Padma Patil. The second was a Slytherin boy called Theo Knott. The third was herself. The fourth was the boy from the cupboard, who was producing, on present evidence, work that he was visibly throttling and that the throttling was failing to entirely conceal. The throttling, she had filed, was an additional anomaly. She would, in time, address the anomaly. She had decided that morning, walking down to breakfast, that the address would not be public, that whatever the boy was doing he was doing on purpose, and that anything she did to expose him would either prove her wrong, in which case she would have made a fool of herself, or prove her right, in which case he would, on present evidence, have to do something about her, and the something might not be what she wished. She therefore filed. She filed in patience. She would, in time, have her turn. The first week of term proceeded along the rails the prospectus had described, and he settled into it with the precise quality of attention he had been cultivating since the dormitory. He noted the staircases. He noted the corridors. He noted the portraits. He noted the patrol patterns of Mr. Filch and the small gray cat called Mrs. Norris that walked, at intervals, slightly ahead of him. He had calculated by the end of the second week that the cat's perception was bound to Mr. Filch's by a charm laid in 1957 that, on present configuration, could be circumvented by a small offering of pilchard. He did not offer her the pilchard yet. He saved it. He went that night to bed at the hour the audience expected, slept the slow, accurate sleep of the night before, and woke at 6 again on the second morning. He repeated on Wednesday the routine of Monday: the window, the trunk, the timetable, the breakfast at 7, the charms class at 9. He repeated it on Thursday. He repeated it on Friday. The routine, which the audience had seen him perform once, now had the patina of a routine he had been performing for years, and the audience on review found nothing in the routine that warranted notice. By Sunday evening, he had calibrated his stammer to the precise tempo of the year's charms class roll call. He had identified the 7 prefects who would, at intervals, be useful. He had measured the length of the candlelight on the staff table at 3 different suppers, and concluded that the floating candles were maintained by a relay charm operated, in shifts, by a senior staff house elf called Tinky. He had begun, in the small private spaces of his attention, the first calibration of the year's chessboard. He had 10 months. The chessboard was satisfactory. The boy from the cupboard sat, that Sunday evening, on his 4-poster with his Hogwarts, a history open on his knees and his charms textbook open on the quilt beside him, and Ron Weasley 2 feet away talking, with the same comfortable freckled volume he had been bringing to a compartment in a train about his brother Charlie. He listened. He nodded. He turned a page. He thought about the 7 sentences he had been preserving since September. He was, in the strictest accounting, exactly where he had meant to be at exactly the hour he had meant to be there. He filed the satisfaction. He went to sleep. Chapter 2 and Chapter 3, Lessons and Lies. The first week of school proceeded along the rails the prospectus had described. Mondays were transfiguration with Professor McGonagall, who handed each student a matchstick on the first day and asked them, in a tone that promised a long acquaintance with disappointment, to turn it into a needle. The being inside the small body produced a matchstick that, by the end of the lesson, had decided to be a needle on its own initiative and gone slightly silvery at one end. He did not let the matchstick complete the transformation. He stopped at the moment of suggestion. McGonagall stood over his desk, lips a single narrow line, and said, "3 points to Gryffindor, Mr. Potter." A promising start. She did not say more. He filed the 3 points. He filed, more carefully, the line of her lips. Tuesdays were double potions with Professor Snape in the dungeon classroom that smelled of old verdigris and a faint, persistent ammoniac sweetness. Snape, who had not stopped looking at him since the welcome feast, opened the term with a quiet speech about the subtle art of cauldron craft that the small body listened to with what the small body believed was honest fascination. Snape concluded the speech by sweeping into the front row and asking him, in the same voice he might have used to discuss a dead relative he had not liked, what one would obtain by adding powdered root of asphodel to an infusion of wormwood. He let the small face produce uncertainty. He let the small mouth open. He stammered, fractionally, "Sorry, sir, I don't know." Snape's lip curled. The lip curled because the curl had been rehearsed in 11 years of waiting against a face the curl had specifically been designed for. Fame clearly isn't everything. He took the line. He let the small face redden. He set at the bottom of his cauldron and at the corner of his ledger the precise measure of the man who had just curled his lip at him. A brilliant accumens, a competent legilimens, a chemist of true talent and durable hatred, a former servant of 2 masters who had built a 3rd allegiance on the body of a woman who had died in Godric's Hollow. The man in black was, beyond all this, a teacher. The teacher could be used. Hermione Granger, 2 rows back, did not say what he believed she had been about to say. She filed his stammer in a ledger of her own. Wednesdays were charms with Professor Flitwick, who stood on a stack of books to address the class and was, by the small body's measure, the best-trained duelist on staff. He let the small body make average progress with the levitation charm. He let Hermione Granger make brilliant progress. He let Ron Weasley make catastrophic progress, because Ron Weasley making catastrophic progress was the comedy the room required. He took the comedy in stride. Thursdays were astronomy at midnight on the highest tower, which was the lesson he found unexpectedly useful, because the rooftops at night were where the school's portrait network was thinnest, and where, on 3 occasions during his first month, he saw a particular man in a purple turban climbing the steps to the 3rd floor without explanation. Fridays were defense against the dark arts. The classroom was on the 2nd floor, in a room that smelled of garlic, sweat, and something faintly metallic that he eventually placed as the residue of a pepper-up potion taken in too high a dose. Professor Quirrell stood at the front of the room with his hands clasped behind his back, and Professor Quirrell stammered. He admired the stammer. It was an excellent stammer. It had been built and tended for 2 years, possibly 3, with the patience of a man who had only recently come into possession of a tool he could not let his colleagues recognize as a tool. The man had laid the stammer like a tablecloth over the dish underneath. The dish underneath had a flavor he had located within a quarter of a second of walking into the room. A small, malformed presence riding the back of the man's neck, slightly to the left of the spine, between vertebrae C2 and C3, knitted into the tissue with the unsubtle craftsmanship of an exiled magician who had taken what he could get. The passenger had a name. He had read the name in 3 of his textbooks. The textbooks had used elliptical formulations, but his own intuition, sharpened on better courts than these, had no difficulty making the identification. Professor Quirrell turned away from the blackboard. Professor Quirrell met his eyes. Professor Quirrell's eyes were watery, evasive, and very honest. The other set of eyes, the ones on the back of the man's neck, looked at him through the back of the man's turban as though through the bottom of a glass. He let the small face register polite confusion. He let the small mouth ask, with charming hesitancy, whether Professor Quirrell thought he would be able to keep up with the syllabus, given that he had grown up among muggles and was, frankly, behind. Professor Quirrell smiled and assured him, in the gentle voice the audience expected, that he was sure Mr. Potter would do very well. The other set of eyes behind the turban did not blink. He filed the eyes. He returned to his seat. The first flying lesson was on a Thursday afternoon in the 2nd week of the term. The lawn was wet. 20 brooms had been laid in 2 rows on the grass. Madame Hooch, a witch with short gray hair and the eyes of an osprey, stood at the head of the rows and inspected them in passes. He stood beside Ron Weasley, who was bouncing on the balls of his feet, and Hermione Granger, who was visibly resisting the urge to consult the 3rd chapter of Quidditch Through the Ages, which she had read the previous evening and not yet trusted herself to remember. The pale boy from Madame Malkin's, 3 brooms over, was holding a remembrall. The remembrall had been sent that morning by Neville Longbottom's grandmother to the small, round-faced boy who had been carrying a toad on the boats. Neville Longbottom had received it at breakfast. The pale boy had taken it from him in the corridor with the small courtesy of a thief in private school. The boys stood at their brooms. "Up," said Madame Hooch. His broom came into his hand, the way a wand came into the hand of a man who had spent enough lifetimes with wands to make the relationship between hand and tool a one-syllable transaction. Ron Weasley's broom came up briskly. Hermione Granger's broom rolled over on the grass and lay still. He noted in the privacy of his attention that brooms were calibrated to confidence in a way wands were not, and that Hermione's broom had not refused her so much as declined to commit until a longer acquaintance had been formed. He filed the calibration. Madame Hooch demonstrated the kickoff, the hover, the gentle descent. She told the class to mount their brooms, kick off, hover for a moment, and come down. Neville Longbottom did not wait for the count. He kicked off, rose 6 feet, rose 12, rose 20, rose into a panic that translated through the broom into more height. The boy was a small frightened pendulum at the bottom of a long string. The string went taut. The boy slipped. Boy fell. He had calculated over the course of 3 seconds that Madame Hooch would not catch the boy. Madame Hooch was 20 paces away with a class of 20 children unattended and a broom of her own laid on the grass. The fall would break the boy's wrist. Neville Longbottom's grandmother, on receiving the news, would be heartbroken, but the broken wrist would heal, and the boy would not, in any of the calculations he had run, be permanently damaged. He had decided to let the wrist break. He let it. The boy hit the ground at the angle his calculations had described. Madame Hooch ran. Madame Hooch comforted the boy. The boy's wrist had broken in 2 places. She took the boy by the elbow and walked him toward the hospital wing. She turned at the gate and addressed the class in the precise tone of a woman who had been doing this for 30 years. "If anyone is in the air when I get back, they will be out of Hogwarts before they can say Quidditch." She left. The pale boy, 15 paces away, picked up the remembrall Neville had dropped on the grass. Maybe if the fat lump had given this a squeeze, he'd have remembered to fall on his fat arse. 2 of the girls laughed. He took in the inside of his attention a small note. The pale boy was performing for the laugh, which was a configuration he had been performing for since the age of 4, and which had taught the pale boy that the laugh was the audience he was required to address. The audience would, when removed, leave the pale boy with the small uncertainty of a performer without a stage. He would arrange that in time. Not this afternoon. "Give it here, Malfoy." This was Ron Weasley's voice. Ron Weasley had stepped forward. Ron Weasley's red ears were the precise red of a Weasley who had not yet learned to hide what he was angry about. The pale boy mounted his broom. The pale boy rose to 20 feet. "Come and get it, Potter." He looked at Ron Weasley. He looked at Hermione Granger. He looked at the broom on the grass beside him. He mounted the broom. He kicked off. The broom rose with him on it in the easy, unhesitating curve a broom produced when its rider had been on one before. He had not been on one before in this lifetime. The broom did not know that. He let the broom not know it. He came up level with the pale boy at 20 feet. Hermione Granger, on the grass below, was shouting something he could not hear over the wind, and which had not been intended to be heard. The pale boy threw the remembrall in a high parabolic arc over the lawn. The arc was good. The arc was the arc of a boy who had thrown things over lawns from a broom every summer of his life since the age of 6. The arc would have ended 40 yards out, in the grass behind the greenhouses, and the remembrall would have shattered. He flew after it. He flew after it in the curve a seeker takes after a snitch, which was a curve he had read about in Quidditch through the ages, and which the broom, on present configuration, was happy to take when shown the line. The line was a calculation. The remembrall's trajectory, the wind's modest cross-component, the angle of the lawn, the height of the greenhouses on the far side, the precise speed at which a clean sweep 6 could be coaxed into terminal velocity descent without the rider falling off it. He let the calculation propagate through the body's hands and seat and shoulders. The body's hands and seat and shoulders performed the calculation as though the body had been doing this since 6 also. He caught the remembrall 4 feet above the grass. He pulled out of the descent in a small curve. He landed in the precise center of the lawn with the small, bewildered face of a boy who had not realized, until the lawn rose up to meet his feet, what he had just done. The pale boy's face, on the broom above him, was the color of the underside of a winter mushroom. Hermione Granger, beside Ron Weasley, looked at him with the expression of a girl who had just filed her 70-second anomaly. Behind him, at the windows of the Charms classroom on the 2nd floor, the witch in green robes who had been on her way down the corridor to give a tutorial to a 5th year, had paused. She came out of the castle 3 minutes later. Potter. He gave her the small uncertainty. Madam Hooch told us, Mr. Potter, you will come with me. Ron Weasley shouted in a kind of horror that it had not been Harry's fault. Hermione Granger did not shout. McGonagall took him by the elbow and walked him in through the great oak doors and up 2 flights and along the corridor to the Charms Wing. She knocked on the door of the room where the Charms Wing's third-year prefect, a boy called Wood, was running through a drill with the next year's reserves. Wood came to the door. McGonagall said, with a precision that the boy did not understand, "Wood, I've found you a seeker." He did not, in his first year, take the position. He let Wood teach him the rudiments after classes for 10 days, and then he said, with the small uncertainty he had been practicing all morning, that he did not feel quite ready for the team and would prefer to watch the year out from the stands. Wood was disappointed. McGonagall accepted his preference with the small disappointment of a teacher who had assumed talent meant ambition. He left them with the impression of a child who had been frightened by his own audition. He had not been frightened. He had been computing. A seeker on the Gryffindor team was, in his first year, the most visible 11-year-old in the school. The visibility would not have served him. The visibility was a cost he had calculated and declined. The flying he had done on the lawn had served a different purpose. It had told McGonagall, and through her Dumbledore, that he was an extraordinarily natural flyer, and the demonstration had been required because Dumbledore's running attention to him had needed a piece of evidence consistent with the figure of a Potter, and the Potters had been flyers, and the demonstration would close for the next 8 weeks, a small gap in the old man's running mental dossier. He filed the closure. Hermione Granger began, the second week, to keep notes on him. He noticed this in the same way he had noticed the spider, in passes without alerting it. She did not write in his presence. She wrote, in a small leather notebook with the words AHG embossed at the corner, after lessons in the library, at a window-side table that had a view down both corridors of the Charms Wing and could be evacuated in 3 seconds. The notebook had begun, by his estimate, on the 2nd of September in pencil, and graduated to ink by the 4th. By the 8th she was writing in 2 colors. The blue was facts, the red was anomalies. He read the notebook over her shoulder 3 times. He did this without crossing into her line of sight. He did this because reading the notebook was the only way to know which of the anomalies she had logged. The anomalies, by the end of the 2nd week, were that he had asked, in passing, whether the staircases at Hogwarts ran on a fixed cycle, and that the question had been the kind of question a boy who had never seen a moving staircase would not, in her experience, think to ask. That he had used the word calibrate twice in a potions lesson, in a context where the word was correct but unusual. That when Ron Weasley had asked him at supper how to spell a word for Charms homework, he had given the spelling without lifting his eyes, and the spelling had been correct, and the word had been one Ron Weasley had only just looked up himself. That in the moments after his sorting, he had looked at the staff table in the order Snape, Dumbledore, Quirrell, McGonagall, Sprout, and that the order had been the order of decreasing tactical relevance to a new student, which was a strange order for a child to assemble. That the stammer he produced under pressure was, on careful timing, more reliable than a real stammer ought to be. The pauses occurred at metrically regular intervals. He was, he noted, going to need to introduce some variance into the stammer. He also noted, with the small grain of professional pleasure that was his analog for affection, that Hermione Granger was the most accurate observer he had been observed by in this country. The wrinkle in the pond at the staff table had not produced a list. The list, sitting in a notebook at a window in the library, was a piece of work. He decided he would not, on present evidence, have to kill her. The decision was not soft. The decision was practical. A Hermione Granger who served his ends was worth more than a Hermione Granger who did not exist. The Hermione Granger he had observed was assemblable into the first kind, if assembled with care. He noted the date on which the assembly would begin. He set it for the second weekend in October. The troll came on Halloween. He had read, in his first month, every published account of the troll defenses at Hogwarts and concluded that the defenses were laughably circumstantial. He had also, on the night of the 7th, intercepted a fragment of conversation between Professor Quirrell and a stone gargoyle on the 4th floor, in which the gargoyle had asked Professor Quirrell whether he intended to bring the snowy diversion he had promised, and Professor Quirrell had said yes, that the snowy diversion would arrive on the 31st. He had not, on the 7th, decided what to do about it. He had not, by the 30th, decided either. He had spent the month watching Hermione Granger in the corridors, at meals, in classes, in the library. He had not yet spoken to her except in the polite exchanges of small classmates. He had noted on the 28th that she had been crying in the girls' bathroom on the 1st floor at lunchtime, because Ron Weasley had made the kind of remark Ron Weasley made and had not yet learned to take back. He had noted on the 29th that she had not been in any class she had said she would be in. He had not yet decided whether to intervene. On the 31st, at the feast, Professor Quirrell ran into the great hall with a face that had been arranged with care to communicate panic. Troll in the dungeons. He let the small face do the right surprise. He let Ron Weasley do the right horror. He filed the location. He calculated in the half-second before Dumbledore's voice rose over the hall that a troll let in through the dungeons would, on the school's predictable geometry, be on the 2nd floor within 9 minutes if the troll moved with intent, and in 26 if the troll moved as trolls usually moved. The prefects evacuated the students. He let Ron Weasley pull him into the corridor with the rest. He let himself remember at exactly the right beat the girl in the bathroom. "Hermione," he said. "She doesn't know." Ron Weasley produced, on cue, the expression he had been wanting his face to produce all term, the expression of a small boy who has noticed, at long last, that he has been unkind, and that the unkindness has placed someone he had not intended to harm into a path with something that would harm her. They peeled off from the crowd. The corridor to the girls' bathroom on the 1st floor was clear. The staff had moved up to the dungeons, on the assumption that the troll was where Professor Quirrell had said it was. The troll, in fact, was approaching the bathroom by a route that required it to come up 2 flights and turn a corner, and the troll had been turning the corner when they arrived. The troll was bigger than he had expected and slower than he had calculated. He let the small face go wide and white. He let Ron Weasley shout the word he had taught him. He let Hermione Granger, when she came out of the cubicle and saw the thing in the doorway, perform the scream that her body needed to perform. He let her, after the scream, look at him, because he was nearest. He gave her, in the half-second that her eyes met his, the look of a small, frightened boy who had run a corridor he should not have to come and find her. Then he let his hand find the troll's club, and he let his small body be lifted onto the troll's shoulder, and he let his wand go up the troll's nose, and he let Ron Weasley speak the Wingardium Leviosa charm he had been failing all week. The club rose. The club dropped. The troll, by an accident of physics that anyone watching would have placed firmly within the bounds of luck, went down without crushing any of the 3 of them. He let his face register the appropriate shock. He fell off the troll. He scrambled to his feet. He made sure he was breathing in the loud, uneven way an exhausted child breathes. Professor McGonagall and Professor Snape and Professor Quirrell arrived in the doorway at the exact instant that he and Hermione Granger and Ron Weasley were standing together over the body of the unconscious troll. And Hermione Granger, who had filed every other anomaly in her notebook with neutral exactness, did the most useful thing she had done all term. She lied. She said, in a voice trembling with what almost everyone in the room read as fright, "It's my fault. Professor McGonagall. I went looking for the troll. I'd read about them and thought I could handle it. If they hadn't come and found me, I'd be dead now. Professor McGonagall, who was a precise woman, was also a precise mother. She accepted the lie because the lie had been told to her with the kind of submissive courage that was, in her experience, the rarest form of courage there was. She took 5 points from Gryffindor. She gave 5 points each to Ron Weasley and to him. She sent the 3 of them up to their common room. He walked behind Hermione Granger at the precise pace that allowed him to watch the back of her head. The back of her head was very still. Professor Snape was watching him at supper the next evening. This was not new. Professor Snape had been watching him at supper for 2 months. But the watching, on the evening of the 1st of November, had a different texture. The texture was of a man who had decided, somewhere in the last 24 hours, that the boy across the hall was either much less or much more than the man had been led to believe. And the watching was, this evening, an attempt to settle the matter. He let the small face be visible. Snape's reach into him that evening was not the surgical drift it had been on the 1st of September. The reach was a deliberate push. Snape had decided to push. Snape had decided that whatever the cost of pushing was, the cost was worth paying. The push met what the push had always met. A small, frightened boy who had fought a troll the night before. A small, frightened boy with a sore shoulder from where the troll's hand had touched it. A small, frightened boy whose memories of the bathroom were trembling and chronological and absolutely consistent with the testimony Hermione Granger had given Professor McGonagall. The small, frightened boy's mind opened to Professor Snape's push the way an unlocked door opens to a man who has tried the handle. And Professor Snape, who had spent a quarter of a century learning what the inside of a guilty mind looked like, walked through the door and looked around and found nothing he had not been shown. The small, frightened boy's surface was honest, complete, and on the surface, and the surface was the only thing the push was equipped to read. Professor Snape narrowed his eyes by a precise degree. He brought his goblet to his mouth. He set the goblet down again. He left the table early. The being inside the small body who had measured Snape's push from the inside without being touched by it, ate his treacle tart at a measured pace and did not look up. The push had failed. The push would, he calculated, be attempted 3 more times during the year with diminishing energy and would each time fail in the same way. Snape would not be a problem. Snape would be a permanent suspicion that could not be discharged into action, because the action required evidence Snape would never obtain. This was the most useful configuration a paranoid Legilimens could be put into. He filed it. He went, that week, into the Forbidden Forest alone. He went after curfew, after the dormitory had stopped breathing in the particular configuration of 5 awake breaths that meant Ron Weasley was not yet asleep. He took the corridor he had mapped on the 2nd night of school. He used a sequence of unobserved passages between the 3rd floor portrait gallery and the entrance hall that the gallery's portraits had not, on prior nights, seen anyone use. He walked across the lawn under a sky that was almost full of moon. The grass was wet. He had not taken off his shoes. The edge of the forest had a ward line he could feel in the soles of his shoes. He stepped over it. In the second clearing, he stopped. The trees here were old enough that the wind in their leaves had a voice of its own. Centaurs lived 2 miles to the north and could not be heard. A hippogriff slept 400 yards to the east and would not wake. He had chosen the clearing because, of all the places in the school's geography that were not actively monitored, this was the clearing most thoroughly unobserved. He was alone. He had not been alone in the technical sense since the morning of the 1st of September. He let, with no one in any direction to hear it, the second mouth speak. His voice, his real voice, was the voice he had used in the cell beneath the central 46 chamber. The voice was silken, formal, courteous to a degree no man had ever needed to be courteous in this country, and accurate to a degree no person in this country would, by any pace of natural learning, be able to imitate. He said to the clearing in a tone of mild observation, "It is going adequately." The clearing said nothing in return, because clearings rarely return remarks. The clearing did not, in any case, repeat the remark to anyone, because nothing in the clearing was equipped to do so, and because the boy's perception had wrapped the clearing in the small private gift he reserved for himself in seasons of work. He spoke, a moment later, 3 more sentences. The first sentence noted that the troll had performed exactly as the schedule had required. The second sentence noted that Hermione Granger had behaved with a precision that exceeded his projections, that the assembly would begin in the second weekend of October as he had decided in September but had been postponed by the troll's intervening utility, and that he would, on consideration, hold the assembly to the 3rd week of November, after the next major event had cleared the corridors. The third sentence noted the loneliness. He noted it the way a quartermaster notes the weather. He noted that the loneliness was real, that the small body produced it whether he attended to it or not, and that he had, in his 11 months in the cell beneath the central 46 chamber, become familiar with a similar sensation that had not been called by the same name. He noted that the sensation, this time, would have to be carried until the work of the year was done. He noted that the carrying would not interfere. The small face in the moonlight did the thing it had not done in any room with a witness in it. It smiled the smile of a man who had finished his round and was returning to his quarters. It was, by every measure available, the smile of an adult. It lasted 3/4 of a second. He turned. He stepped back over the ward line. He walked across the lawn under the almost full moon. He went up the stairs to the 4th floor by a passage that, behind him, the gallery's portraits had again not seen anyone use. He climbed into his 4-poster. He arranged his shoes, which were wet, beneath the bedside table at the angle that a tired boy would arrange them. He slept. In a tower across the courtyard, the old man with half-moon spectacles, who could not have seen the smile, looked up from his desk and looked, with the same small wrinkle in the pond he had produced at the welcome feast, at the moon. He turned a piece of paper. He wrote a note. The note read, "Ask Severus to try again." The note did not say what Severus was being asked to try at. It did not have to. On the night of the 17th of October, he received a detention from Mr. Filch for being out of the dormitory after curfew. The detention was, on its face, an injustice. He had not been out of the dormitory. He had been in the dormitory and had subsequently been recorded by Mr. Filch as having been out of it, because Mr. Filch had been informed by the small gray cat that a student had been seen walking the 2nd-floor corridor, and the small gray cat's identification had been wrong. The student, in fact, had been a 5th-year girl from Hufflepuff who looked, at a distance and from behind, very like him. He could have argued. Arguing would have left a record. He took the detention. He accepted, with the small uncertainty he had been giving Mr. Filch since September, the assignment to Hagrid's hut on the night of the 19th. The hut, on the night of the 19th, was warm and smelled of pipe smoke and dog, and the slightly singed wood that meant Hagrid had been doing something with the fireplace that the fireplace did not entirely approve of. He sat in the chair Hagrid offered him and drank a cup of tea that had been brewed too long. The boarhound, Fang, drooled on his shoe and slept. Hagrid told him, in the gentle voice that was Hagrid's only voice, about the unicorn that had been found dead in the 8th section of the Forbidden Forest the previous week. He listened. Hagrid told him the unicorn had been killed by something he did not have a name for. Hagrid told him the unicorn was not the first. Hagrid told him that the Forbidden Forest this autumn contained a creature that should not have been in it. Hagrid told him that the creature would, on Professor Dumbledore's instruction, be tracked. The detention was to assist with the tracking. He stood. He took up the lantern Hagrid had given him. He followed Hagrid out of the hut and along the lawn to the edge of the forest. The forest, in October at midnight, was a much louder place than it had been on the night of the clearing. A wind in the upper branches. Owls. The occasional crack of a branch under the foot of something larger than an owl. Hagrid held his crossbow in the careful grip of a man who would not, in this country's wars, have been an ineffective combatant. Fang trotted alongside, drooling at intervals. He walked 3 paces behind Hagrid. They came, after 20 minutes of walking, to a small clearing in which the silvery body of the unicorn lay in the moonlight. The silver of the unicorn's blood had pooled on the leaves around it. The pool was wet. The pool had been wet for less than 10 minutes. Hagrid breathed in. Hagrid turned to him and said very quietly, "Stay back." He stayed back. He could, in the inside of his attention, hear the small barometric flicker that meant the parasite was, at the present moment, in this clearing. The parasite had been here. The parasite had been here for some minutes. The parasite had been drinking the unicorn's blood. The parasite was, on detection of their lanterns, in the process of moving away into the trees. He let the parasite move. He could have, with 3 of the 7 sentences he had been preserving for the year, dragged the parasite out of the trees and into the clearing where Hagrid's crossbow could have settled the matter. He did not. The headmaster's plan required the parasite alive until May. He had decided in September that the headmaster's plan was the plan he would let the year run on, because the plan was a plan he could see all of, and a plan he could see all of was a plan whose terminus he could rewrite. He let Hagrid examine the unicorn. He let Hagrid swear briefly, in a register he had not previously known Hagrid had. He let himself, as a small piece of theater for the man who would no doubt be reading Hagrid's account of the evening in the morning, give the unicorn's body a stricken look that an 11-year-old boy would give the body of an animal of that kind. The look was a piece of theater. Inside it, he was filing the precise tactical information the parasite's presence in the clearing had given him. The parasite was still recovering from its arrival. The parasite was feeding from a creature whose blood would, at its current rate of consumption, sustain it through November. The parasite was, on present configuration, still strong enough to attempt the corridor in May, but not strong enough to attempt it before then. He filed. Hagrid took him back to the hut. Hagrid gave him a second cup of tea. Hagrid, on the 3rd drink, told him in a small, confidential voice that there were things in the school the boy should not be expected to understand, and that the boy should perhaps stay out of the 3rd-floor corridor. He gave Hagrid the small uncertainty of a child who had been told a thing he did not understand. He thanked Hagrid for the tea. He went, after midnight, back to the castle, by way of a passage he had identified in his 2nd week. He went asleep. He dreamed, in the precise middle of the dream hours, the small dream of a man who had been raised to dream of his work. The dream was of a chamber on the 3rd floor and of a face on the back of a man's neck, and of 7 sentences he had been preserving for a conversation in May. The dream was not, in the strictest accounting, restful. He slept through it. He had been sleeping through his dreams for 2 centuries. Chapter 3 and Chapter 4. The library recruitment November in the Highlands had a particular kind of light. It was not, technically, light. It was the absence of light arranged into shades, the way a deaf person arranges silences into the structure of a song. The lake was iron. The sky over the lake was iron. The trees on the far bank were iron. He noticed the iron at intervals between the segments of work, and he found that the iron suited him. He had elected, in his 3rd week of the month, to allow Hermione Granger to find him. The decision was not loud. He did not arrange a confrontation. He arranged, instead, the absence of his own avoidance. He stopped routing around her in the corridors. He allowed his free periods to coincide with her library shifts, and he sat, on one Wednesday afternoon, at the table she had been occupying every Wednesday afternoon since September. He arranged this in a way that suggested coincidence to anyone watching it. There was no one watching it. He arranged it anyway. She came in at 3:20, with the bag she carried only on Wednesdays, and saw him at her table. She did not show what she did with her face. Hermione Granger had grown, in the 8 weeks since the troll, into a girl who could conceal a thought she had decided to conceal. He approved of the growth. He had, in his earlier life, taught the same growth to a half-dozen lieutenants, and he had never been able to fully predict how it would alter the lieutenant once it had taken hold. She sat down opposite him. She set her bag on the floor. She opened a textbook on charms. She did not speak. He let the silence run for 40 seconds. He let her, in that interval, decide what she had come to the table for. She had not, in fact, come to the table for anything. She had come to her usual table on her usual Wednesday and found him in it. What she would now decide was whether to acknowledge the table's occupancy in any way other than by sitting at it. He gave her the time to decide. He marked the decision time on the inside of his attention. She decided on the 38th second to speak. "You're sitting at my table." "I'm sorry," he said. "I didn't know I'll move." She watched him reach for his bag with what she allowed to look like irritation. "No, don't be silly. It's not really my table. I just sit here." It looked like a good table. It is a good table. It has a view of both corridors. She had said it before she had thought about saying it. She heard herself say it. She filed the saying. He filed her filing. He did not look up at her. He did not need to. "That's clever," he said. "I didn't think of that." "Didn't you?" She did not believe him. She did not say she did not believe him. She opened her charms book to the chapter on the locomotion charm, the chapter they had been assigned for the following Monday's lesson, and she began to read in the absence of any further conversation. He let her read for 40 minutes. At 4:10 he closed his own book, looked up, and said, in the same stammering register he had been using all term, "Do you want to have tea?" She looked up. She regarded him for the length of a breath. She said, "Where?" "There's a corner by the History of Magic section. It's behind the 3rd pillar. Madam Pince doesn't see it from her desk. I've been working there sometimes." She did not ask how a boy who had not used the library more than 3 times in her observation had identified a blind spot in the librarian's sight lines. She nodded. "I have a flask," she said. "I bring tea sometimes. It's better than the kitchen's tea. I'd like some, please." They went to the corner. It was the corner he had selected for the conversation in the 2nd week of October, 3 weeks before he had revised the schedule. The corner had 2 virtues. The first was that it could not be seen from Madam Pince's desk, from either of the 2 doorways, or from the gallery above. The second was that its acoustic properties were unusual. A quiet voice at the table carried less than 5 feet in any direction. Because the stone of the 3rd pillar had been carved, 4 centuries ago, by a headmaster who had wanted the corner for exactly the kinds of conversations he was about to have in it. He had identified the corner in his first month. He had not used it. He had been saving it. She poured tea from the flask into 2 small chipped cups she produced from her bag. She passed one across the table. The tea was strong, dark, faintly metallic at the back of the mouth, with 2 crystals of sugar already dissolved into it. He took it with the small hands. He sipped. "Thank you." She watched him drink. She watched him swallow. She watched him set the cup down. She said quietly, without preamble, "I know what you are." He let the small face register polite confusion. He let the small mouth open to ask what she meant. She put up a hand. Don't do that. I have been watching you since the train, and I have a notebook with 71 entries in it, and the entries are correct. You are not what you have been pretending to be. I don't know what you are instead. I have not decided whether you are dangerous. I have decided that I am owed the conversation." He let the small face hold the polite confusion for a single second more. He let it dissolve in front of her, with the deliberate exactness of an actor stepping out of a role he had been performing flawlessly for 3 months. The face that took the small face's place was not, on the surface, very different. The cheekbones were the cheekbones the small body had been born with. The eyes were the eyes she had been looking at since September. The mouth was the mouth. What changed was the alignment. The boy she had been sitting across from had carried his shoulders in the slight forward hunch of a child who had been small in a household that had taught him to be smaller. The shoulders, now, came back a fraction of an inch into the alignment of a man who had not, in his own first life, been small. The boy's stammer dissolved. The boy's eyes, which had been carrying the polite uncertainty he had given them on the platform, found her eyes and did not let them go. The boy's voice, when it next spoke, was the voice he had used in the clearing in the forest. It was silken, formal, and courteous to a degree she had not heard a voice be in her life. "You are owed it. You have earned it. I will give it to you in such measure as the conversation will safely bear." She did not move. She had thought, in the seconds before she had said what she had said, that the worst thing he could do was deny the 71 entries, the second worst thing he could do was confirm them, and the third worst thing he could do was confirm them and ask her to forget. She had not, in any of those calibrations, prepared herself for what he in fact did, which was speak to her in a voice she had no analog for and look at her, across 2 chipped cups of tea, with the steady attention of a man who had made a deliberate decision to look. He let her take 12 seconds. He used the 12 seconds to read her face. He read her face the way a man reads a letter he has been waiting for. The face read, alarm, then recognition, then the first beat of the high cognitive pleasure that comes when a long-held private theory is at last confirmed by an external source. The pleasure was the door he had been waiting to find open. He spoke. "My name is not the name you have been using for me. It is the name you have been using for me, in this body, in this country, on this continent, and the name will continue to be the name. The portion of me that is not this body's name has another. I will not give the other name to you. To give it to you would burden you with information you cannot use, and that any reader of you would be able to discover from you under duress. We will not be burdening you with information of that kind." She nodded. She nodded because the explanation she had been given was, in the strictest accounting, more respectful of her safety than any other explanation she had ever been offered. "You have been keeping a notebook. The notebook is the work of an extraordinarily talented observer. It is also, in the present configuration of this castle, the most dangerous document in the room. If anyone other than you ever reads it, you will be questioned. The questioning will not be by Professor Snape, who already suspects without evidence and will continue to suspect without evidence. The questioning will be by an old man with half-moon spectacles, who suspects also, who is gentler than Professor Snape, and who is better. You will not survive that questioning with your independence of thought intact, because that is not what the old man's questioning is for. He loves his pupils too much to leave them as he finds them. I will require as the first item of the conversation that the notebook be destroyed. I will not require ever that you stop observing." She did the small private smile of a person who had been hoping for an outcome and had been too disciplined to admit it. "It's already destroyed." "When?" "Last Thursday. After I'd memorized it." He let his own face, the silken formal face, produce, for the second time in 2 minutes, a small expression that no one in this country had ever seen him produce. The expression was the expression of a chess player who has set down his bishop in the place he chose for it and found that his opponent has already foreseen the move and is waiting for him at the next turn but 2. "That is excellent. What is the second item?" He took a sip of her tea. He set the cup down. He folded his hands on the table. The second item is that I will, in the course of the next 6 months, do several things in your hearing or sight that will not appear to you to be consistent with the boy you have been sitting next to in lessons. You will not, when these things occur, react to them in any way that an observer would read. You will continue to be the brilliant, anxious, slightly self-righteous classmate of Ronald Weasley and of the boy at your table. You will in private ask me what I have done, and I will in private answer you. The answer may not always be the answer you wish. The answer will be the answer I am able to give. She thought. She thought for 19 seconds. She said, "Why are you giving me this?" "Because you are useful. Because the version of you who is alive and well and walking beside me through the corridors of this school for the next 7 years will be a more efficient instrument of every plan I have than the version of you who is dead, and very much more so than the version of you who is alive and not walking beside me. Because I am, at the level of my person, capable of preferring company that knows what I am to company that does not, even when the preferring is inconvenient. Because the boy you have been observing has been very lonely, in a way it would be difficult for me to explain to you in fewer than 9 hours, and I have decided I would rather spend a portion of that 9 hours speaking to you than reserve it entirely for myself." She thought. She thought for 23 seconds. She said, "I want the third item. The third item is your refusal." He took her in. He took her in the way he had taken in the wand in Diagon Alley, when the wand had warmed to the temperature of his pulse, and he had noticed, in himself, the small private pleasure of acquiring a tool he had not had since the cell. "You may, at this moment, refuse what I am offering you. The refusal will not result in your death. I have already said it will not, and I do not lie to you in this corner on this Wednesday with this tea between us. The refusal will result instead in a quiet adjustment to the way I move through the castle. You will not see me at this table again. You will continue to be sat behind in charms and to disagree with me, mildly in transfiguration. You will continue to be in your common room, and I will continue to be in mine. You will not be harmed. You will also not, at any future moment in your life, hear from me what you are about to hear, or stand in the room with me when something occurs that will require the conversation to continue." She thought. She thought for 37 seconds. She said, "Tell me one thing that is true that no one else knows." He smiled. It was the silken formal smile, not the smile he had used in the clearing. The two smiles were different in their shape. He said, "Professor Quirrell is carrying on the back of his skull the partial soul of the man who killed my mother. The partial soul is parasitic. It has been with Professor Quirrell since the spring. Before that, it was in a forest in Albania. The partial soul wishes to acquire, through the third-floor corridor, the Philosopher's Stone. The stone is at present being kept on the 3rd floor under defenses that an averagely competent 5th year could pass. The defenses are not in their present form because the school is incompetent. They are in their present form because the headmaster has decided to allow the partial soul to attempt the corridor in order to provoke an event of his own design. He has not told me that he has decided this. He has not told anyone that he has decided this. I know it because I have been watching him." She took it in. She did not in any visible way react. After 13 seconds she said, "That is one thing. It is. You want me in. I want you to choose. I have given you the information that will let you choose. If you choose to walk away from this table now, the information will go with you, and I will trust your judgment to do nothing with it, and you will trust my judgment when I say I will not harm you to be the judgment of a person whose word has been given. I do not give it often. I do not give it lightly." She thought. She thought for a single minute. He did not interrupt the minute. At the end of the minute she said, very quietly, "I'm in." He drank his tea. "Then we will be friends, you and I, in the small ways that friends are friends in this castle. You will continue to harangue Ronald Weasley about his transfiguration homework. You will continue to disapprove of my flying. You will continue to be the brightest witch in our year, and you will not under any circumstance, not even in the privacy of a corridor, perform at a level above what an observer would expect from the brightest witch in our year. You will not, in any conversation with any adult, allude to the conversation we have just had. The allusion will be detected by a craftsman who is much better at this kind of work than you presently are. You will, when something is required of you, hear it from me in a tone that resembles this one, and when no such tone is present, what I am saying to you is the noise the boy at your table is supposed to be saying, and you will respond to it as the brilliant, anxious, slightly self-righteous classmate would respond. She nodded. She drank her tea. He drank his tea. The 2 cups were chipped. The corner was unobserved. The afternoon light on the iron lake outside the high library window had begun to turn the precise shade of pewter that meant the day would be over within the hour. She said, before she stood, "What do you want from this country?" He looked at her. He let the silken formal smile fade by a degree. He did not lie. He did not, on the matter, have to. "I do not know yet. I have been here 11 years. I will be here longer. The country was selected for me by an accident I did not control. I have spent the 11 years observing. The observations are not yet complete. When they are complete, I will know what I want. Until then, I want to be left alone to finish them, and since being left alone is no longer possible, I want a single companion who can hold a notebook in her head and not allow it to be read by other people." She held the cup in both her hands. She said, "All right." She picked up her bag. She walked, with the same forward stance she had carried into the carriage on the 1st of September, between the 3rd pillar and the history of magic shelves, and out of the library by the south door. He sat at the table for 40 seconds. He brought the second mouth back behind the first. The small face came back into the alignment it had carried since the platform. The shoulders came back into the slight forward hunch. The stammer, which had been audible in his interior to a degree he had not been audible to himself in 3 months, dissolved. He stood. He took the cups to the small basin in the corner the elves used to retrieve abandoned crockery. He went down through the corridor to the great hall. Ron Weasley was waiting in the entrance with an indignant expression that was, by the careful self-discipline of his face, entirely sincere. "Where have you been? I've been looking for you for an hour. Snape took 5 points off me for breathing in his corridor." Sorry," he said. "I was in the library. With Hermione, she was there." "Blimey, you're not going to start studying with her, are you?" He let the small face do something complicated. He let it settle into the wry smile of a boy who has, against his own intention, found that the company of the brightest girl in his year is not, in the end, intolerable. "I think she said something about checking my transfiguration." Ron Weasley groaned. Ron Weasley clapped him on the shoulder. Ron Weasley said, "Mate, you cannot let her run you. She'll have you reading Hogwarts, a history before Christmas." He let the small face produce the appropriate horror. The second Wednesday in November brought a thin sleet across the lake that turned, by 4 o'clock, into the kind of half-snow that did not, on the school's roof, decide whether to stick. She came into the library at 3:20, with the bag she carried only on Wednesdays. She set the bag on the floor of the corner behind the 3rd pillar. She produced the flask. She poured the 2 cups. She passed one across the table. He took it. She said before she sat down, "I have been thinking all week about what you said." He looked up. "Which part?" "All of it, but specifically the part about the man on the back of Professor Quirrell's neck. I have not in 8 days been able to put it down. I have asked myself whether what you told me was a working hypothesis or a fact. I have concluded it was a fact. I have not asked myself how you would know." "Ask." She sat. She drank her tea. "How would you know?" He took, from the table beside the flask, a small biscuit she had baked that morning. He bit into it, he chewed. He set the remainder of it down on a saucer that had not been on the table when she had brought the flask. "I would know," he said, in the silken formal register, "because I am familiar, at the level of my own previous life, with the configuration of beings who have placed themselves in the bodies of other beings. The configuration produces a small, unmistakable pressure. The pressure is not occult, and it is not magical. It is the pressure of a living mind that has been compressed into a body it does not fit. The pressure is detectable to a person who has spent enough years learning to detect it, in the cadence of the host's breathing, in the way the host's pupils dilate when the passenger is paying attention, in the lag between a movement of the host's hand and the host's verbal account of why the hand has moved. I have been observing Professor Quirrell for 8 weeks. The pressure is consistent with a parasite of approximately the size and damage I described to you. I have, in addition, the entirely supporting evidence that the parasite in question is one I am uniquely positioned to recognize. Because his curse, 11 years ago, was the curse that should have killed me. Because the recognition is mutual. And because Professor Quirrell, on 3 separate occasions in the corridor outside my defense classroom, has stared at the side of my head with the precise stare of a man who has decided he should not be staring. She nodded. She said, "Could you, before he attempts the stone, simply kill him?" I could. Why won't you? Because the parasite would survive. He has been doing this for 10 years. He would crawl into the next available animal, Hagrid's dog. The Forbidden Forest centaurs would not deign to host him. The Whomping Willow has no nervous system to occupy. The parasite is too small to make a snake competent and too large to be entirely absorbed by a small mammal. He requires a human host. If I kill Professor Quirrell, the parasite will, in the time it takes Hagrid to notice the body, vacate it. The vacating will be inconvenient to him and inconvenient to me, because I will then have to track him to whichever Albanian forest he has chosen as the next staging area. I would rather know where he is. He is, at the present hour, in Hogwarts. He will continue to be in Hogwarts until the spring. The spring is a season I am comfortable with. And you will let him try the corridor. I will let him try the corridor. The corridor's defenses on present configuration will not stop him. The corridor's defenses on present configuration will not stop me. The stone, if he reaches it, will not give itself to him. It has been bound by the old man with half-moon spectacles to a mirror, and the binding is the binding of intent, and the parasite does not have the intent the binding will require. He will fail. I will, at the appropriate moment, intervene. She watched him drink. She said, "You are using my year as a stage. I am using everyone's year as a stage. This is the year in which Voldemort's first attempted return is scheduled, by the long planning of an old man with half-moon spectacles who has been arranging for the return since the summer of 1991. The arrangement has produced a situation. The situation has produced opportunities. I would have preferred a year in which the school had been quiet. The quiet would have allowed me to grow up at the pace I had calculated. The year is not quiet. I will not waste it." She did not flinch. She had been thinking all week about whether she could not be a participant in a year that was being used as a stage. She had concluded that the difference between the year being used by him and the year being used by Dumbledore was a difference she could no longer use, because she had already chosen on a Wednesday 2 weeks earlier the side she was on. She drank the rest of her tea. She said, "Tell me what to do." He set down his cup. "For the rest of the term, you will do nothing that I have not asked of you. You will continue, at the level of your visible behavior, to be the brilliant, anxious, slightly self-righteous classmate of Ronald Weasley. You will continue to receive top marks in charms and transfiguration. You will not, in any class, demonstrate that you have understood the lecturer's material faster than the lecturer expects. You will, in the second week of December, develop a small cold, which I will provide you with the ingredients to produce. The cold will excuse you from a particular lesson on a particular afternoon at which your presence would be inconvenient to me. In January, you will write to your parents and inform them that you will be staying at Hogwarts for the spring holidays, and that you are very sorry, and that you will see them in the summer. In February, you will help me in the corner behind the third pillar with a piece of analysis I am preparing for an event that will occur in May. In March, you will resume your full friendship with Ronald Weasley, which you will have allowed to recover gradually after the troll. In April, you will be present at the dragon-related event we have begun last week to suspect Hagrid is about to be lured into. In May, you will accompany me 3 paces back into the corridor on the 3rd floor. We will then leave the corridor. We will then be sat in the hospital wing, where you will say to me what you have been waiting to say, and where I will tell you what we will do in the 2nd year. The summer will be the summer. She memorized it. She had spent her childhood memorizing things, and her memory could absorb 7 points of operational planning in the time other minds absorbed a phone number. She did not write the 7 points down. The notebook in her head was sufficient. She said last, "I will need to send my parents some letters this term that contain no information." Send them. Make the letters charming. The charm of a letter that contains no information is, on present configuration, the most efficient cover available to us. She smiled. The smile was a small private smile, not the smile she had been giving Ronald Weasley. It was the smile of a person who had been hoping for an outcome and had been too disciplined to admit it. That night, in the bedroom under the eaves of the girls' dormitory, she sat on the edge of her bed with her shoes still on, and looked at the small jar of pepper-up potion she had been carrying in her bag and thought about him. She had been thinking about him every night for 2 weeks. What had previously been the loud, anxious internal monologue of a brilliant new witch had been replaced, in those 2 weeks, by a quieter and more accurate internal monologue. The new monologue had retained the brilliance and pared down the anxiety. The pared-down anxiety had freed up a kind of attention she had not previously known her own mind contained. She was paying that attention to the school. She was paying it to her dorm mates. She was paying it, in particular, to the boy across the common room. The boy, on close attention, was a more compact phenomenon than he had previously appeared. He was carrying something inside him that she did not have a word for, and that he had agreed, in a corner of the library, not to give her a word for. She was, on present configuration, content with that arrangement. She lay down. She slept the careful sleep she had been sleeping since November. Dumbledore, at his desk in the high tower, wrote a letter to Severus Snape. The letter said, in the gentle handwriting that had been the handwriting of the headmaster's correspondence for 41 years, "Severus, try again, please. The small surgical reach at our young friend. Please make a real effort this time. I should like to know whether the surface I have observed at 3 meals running is the surface, or whether there is a deeper surface beneath the surface I have been calling the surface, which I have not yet noticed. Yours, A." He sealed the letter. He gave it to Fawkes. Fawkes took it. The letter arrived at the dungeon office of the potions master at 20 to 9. The potions master read it. The potions master folded it. The potions master, who was, on the whole, a man whose face had not been given to revealing what he intended, allowed it to register in the small contraction of the brow the precise irritation he had been carrying since September. That the brat had not yet given him the satisfaction of a single piece of evidence against the brat's surface. That the brat, on 6 attempts now, had presented a surface that was, in the strictest accounting, indistinguishable from the truth. He would try again. He always tried again. At the high table that evening, Dumbledore looked twice at a girl 2 tables down. He looked twice because the girl, who had been a familiar weather pattern in the dining hall for 2 months, the pattern of a brilliant new witch whose interior was loud, anxious, ambitious, and on the surface, had this evening a slightly different surface. The interior was not loud. The interior had been polished. He could not have said by what, he could not have said how, he could not have said when. He could only say that a mind he had been watching with the gentle peripheral attention with which he watched all his students had, in the last several hours, become quieter. The quieting was not unhealthy. It was not even unusual. Pupils acquired this kind of quiet between the autumn term and the spring of the second year, as the noise of being 11 gave way to the noise of being 12. It had happened in this case faster. He filed it. He looked, 2 tables farther down, at the boy he had been filing since the sorting. The boy was eating treacle tart at a measured pace and laughing at something Ronald Weasley had said. The boy looked exactly the way he had looked on the 1st of September, and the way he had looked the morning after the troll, and the way he had looked at every supper since the term began. The boy was, to every external measure, a small, frightened boy who was beginning, slowly, to learn that the world he had been brought into was kinder to him than the world he had been brought out of. The old man took, from the small dish at his elbow, a sherbet lemon, and ate it slowly. He had been the head master of this castle for 41 years. He had, in those 41 years, seen one sorting that he could not account for and several pupils who had grown, over the course of their first year, into adults at a rate the staff had decided to attend to closely. He had not in any of those 41 years sat at a table and looked, on a Wednesday evening in November, at a small frightened boy and a brilliant girl who were eating, 15 yards apart at separate tables, and felt the precise pressure he was feeling now. The pressure was not alarm. The pressure was the small wrinkle on the surface of an old pond, which had now come twice from the same direction, and was therefore no longer the kind of wrinkle that closed. He ate his sherbet lemon. He told no one. He decided he would, at the Christmas feast, give the boy one of the last surviving cloaks in the country, the one his own school friend's son had inherited, and which a chain of decisions had placed in the headmaster's safe. He decided he would tell no one about the cloak either. He decided that between November and December, he would write a single careful letter to Severus and ask Severus to try, one more time, the small surgical reach he had been failing to land at supper. Across the hall, a boy who had been watching his every micro-expression for 14 weeks watched the old man eat the sherbet lemon and concluded, with the small satisfaction of a chess player whose opponent has not yet seen the rook, that the next move would be the cloak. He had been looking forward to the cloak. Chapter 4, in Chapter 5. Chess pieces snow came in the second week of December and stayed. The lake, which had spent November turning iron, finished its work by the morning of the 18th and was a slab of white-gray under a sky of paler white-gray. The owls coming up from the south were unsteady against the wind. The gargoyles on the 3rd floor wore caps of snow that made them look briefly forgivable. He noted, walking to breakfast with Ronald Weasley on the day school broke for the holidays, that the castle in winter was the second most beautiful building he had been in during either of his lives, and he revised the ranking from his first impression on the lake in September to take account of the snow. He had elected to stay over Christmas. Ron Weasley was staying. The other 3 boys in his dormitory were going home. The Weasleys staying, Ron, the twins, the prefect, would be the closest configuration of his year mates to a constituency. Hermione Granger was going home to Hampstead Garden suburb, having been given a list of 7 non-suspicious things to attend to over the holiday by a boy who had sat with her in the library corner 2 further times since the Wednesday in November, and had given her the second silken formal voice on each occasion. She would return on the 2nd of January. She had taken the list. She had read it once and burnt it. The morning of the 25th of December broke clear. He woke at 6. Ron Weasley was already sitting up, hair on end, on his bed across the room, surrounded by a small mountain of brown paper parcels that the boy had clearly opened in chronological order and now wished to share. The freckled face was a study in the second uncomplicated pleasure he had observed it in. The first had been the corned beef sandwich in their first compartment, and the second was this. The pleasure of giving had no political weight. The pleasure of giving was, in 11 years, the thing his own life had taught him least well, and he found he admired it on Ron Weasley's face the way one admires a skill one has not learned. "Harry," said Ron Weasley, "you've got presents." He registered the surprise the small face required. There were 4 parcels. The first was a sweater of bottle green wool from Ron Weasley's mother, with the letter H knitted onto the front in red, accompanied by a tin of fudge. He held the sweater for the count of 3. He thanked Ron Weasley as though the sweater had come from Ron Weasley. He pulled it on over his pajamas. It fit. He was the size, this year, of a boy who was the size of the boy that mother had been knitting for. The second parcel was a 50-pence piece in a box from the Dursleys. The third parcel was a small carved chess set from Hermione Granger, with a card that said in her round, careful handwriting, "For our Wednesdays, make Ron play." The fourth parcel was the parcel he had been waiting for. It was wrapped in plain brown paper. The card on it bore a single sentence in writing he recognized as the writing he had seen once on the corner of an exam timetable taped to the staff room door. "Your father left this in my possession before he died. It is time it was returned to you. Use it well." There was no signature. He let the small face do the small piece of theater it owed an audience of one freckled witness. He let his fingers fumble with the paper. He pulled it open. A waterfall of silver-gray fabric ran out across the bedspread. Ron Weasley said, "Blimey." He let the small mouth shape the word cloak in the half-syllable a boy who had never owned one would speak it, and he let his small fingers, for the sake of the audience, drape the cloak experimentally over his arm. The lower half of his arm vanished. Ron Weasley's eyes went the diameter of crown coins. He did not, at any point, let the cloak touch his right hand. His right hand was where his attention was. Cloaks of this caliber, there were 3 in the country. He had read about them. The headmaster's safe had been known to him within his second week as the location of at least one, were tools whose pedigree was the pedigree of a family, and the families who had built them with intent-keyed inheritance bindings. A pure inheritance binding would have read the cloak's bearer's blood and confirmed the bearer as the next in the line. He was the next in the line. The cloak would not, in theory, complain. The cloak did not complain. What it did, instead, when the silver-gray fabric brushed his fingers, was register a presence under the Potter blood that the Potter blood was not. The cloak's recognition routine was simple. The fabric had been woven at some distant century by hands that had wanted the cloak to know its own. The fabric had a small private opinion. It had not been asked in 9 centuries to render a verdict on a wearer whose blood was the line and whose interior was not the species. It rendered the verdict it had been built to render. It recognized the Potter blood. It accepted the wearer. It noted, in the closed register of its own perception, that the wearer was a being whose own perception was wrapped around the perception of the cloak, in a way the cloak had not previously been wrapped around by. And it accepted that, too, because the cloak was, in the bones of its being, a tool that had been built by men who had decided to outlive death, and it recognized something in his attention that it had not been built to recognize, but that it had been built. The way a good lock is built to accommodate keys not yet cut, to make room for. He filed the cloak's recognition. The cloak settled. He thanked Ron Weasley as though Ron Weasley had given him the cloak. He thanked Hermione Granger in his mind for the chess set. He thanked the old man with half-moon spectacles, also in his mind, with the small, careful pleasure of a chess player who has seen his opponent advance the rook to the square. He had been hoping the rook would be advanced too. He did not, on Christmas morning, use the cloak. He waited until evening. The corridor on the third floor at midnight was the only corridor in the castle that ran on a schedule. He had measured the schedule. It was 3 Filch patrols, 2 prefect circuits, 1 Mrs. Norris perimeter, and 4 owl trips through the high windows, distributed across 46 minutes of variable timing. The slack time between the 4th owl trip and the 2nd prefect circuit was 11 minutes. 11 minutes was, by his measure, enough. He had not, in the 4 months he had been at Hogwarts, gone near the 3rd floor at night. He had been waiting. He went that Christmas night not to the 3rd floor. He went with the cloak settled across his shoulders, down a corridor on the 4th floor that the school's portrait network had told him, over 4 months of careful gossip mapping, contained a door no student had been in. The door opened on an unused classroom. The classroom contained a mirror. He had heard about the mirror in his 2nd week. He had not gone to look for it. He had not gone to look for it because the mirror, on the schoolyard accounts that had come to his ear at supper, was the mirror of the deepest desire, and he had not been willing, in the first 3 months of his year, to give the mirror the 4 minutes of his attention it would have required, on the chance that the mirror would give him nothing, or, much worse, would give him an answer. He had decided in the last week of November that he would visit it before the holidays. He went on Christmas night, because Christmas night was the night of the lowest patrol density of the year. He went on Christmas night, because the boy he was pretending to be would have visited the mirror on Christmas night in the canon he had read, and because, if Dumbledore had decided to place the cloak in his hands today, the cloak's placement was a test, and the test required a destination, and the destination was here. He pushed open the door. The mirror was tall, gold-framed, set against the far wall, dust on its lower edge. It was lit by a low light that he could not, looking around the room, source. The light came from inside the mirror. He let, for 1 second, the second mouth speak. "Era stra eru oit ube kafru oit on wosi," he said, reading the engraving along the top and reversing the letters, and finding the sentence the engraving was. "I show not your face but your heart's desire." He stepped in front of it. The mirror showed him. It showed him a small boy with a fringe falling across a thin scar on the forehead, in pajamas under a bottle green sweater, with a silver-gray cloak across his shoulders. The boy in the mirror was looking back at him with an expression he recognized. The expression was not the polite uncertainty of the platform. The expression was not the silken formal courtesy of the corner of the library. The expression was not the small private smile of the clearing in the forest. The expression was the expression of a person who had been looking for an hour and a half at the place where his own face was supposed to be, and finding, where the face was supposed to be, nothing he could call anyone's. The boy in the mirror was hollow. There was, behind the eyes, no inhabitant. He stood in front of the mirror for 1 minute. He thought in the minute about 3 things. The first thing he thought about was the cell beneath the central 46 chamber, and how the cell had been the loneliest room he had been in his first life, and how the loneliness in the cell had been the loneliness of a man whose plans had run their course and who was now obliged to wait. The second thing he thought about was the cupboard under the stairs. The third thing he thought about was the conversation he had had with Hermione Granger in a corner of the library behind the 3rd pillar on a Wednesday in November. The mirror did not change. The boy in the mirror went on being hollow. He turned away. He did not go back to the mirror in his 2nd week of January, as he calculated Dumbledore would expect him to. He did not seek it out again. He had received the information the mirror had been built to give him. The information was that the small body did not, at its center, want anything. The information was further that the inhabitant of the small body wanted something that was not, in the language the mirror spoke, articulable, and that the mirror, faced with an inhabitant whose desire could not be rendered into a face, had rendered the absence of the face honestly. He found that he respected the mirror. He walked back through the corridor with the cloak settled across his shoulders. He did not, on the way back, speak to himself in the second voice. He did not need to. The holidays were the quietest 2 weeks the castle had given him. The corridors emptied. The portraits, with no audience to gossip to, settled into longer silences and longer postures. The kitchen scaled back to 2 meals a day. The skeleton staff that stayed for the holidays, McGonagall, Sprout, Flitwick, the half-giant, the man in black, the man with the turban, the old man with half-moon spectacles, and the librarian's hairy black cat, moved through the building at the diminished pace of people whose obligations had been paused, and who were not entirely sure what to do with the pause. He liked the pause. He had, in his previous life, never been given one of the right kind. He used the pause. He spent 4 mornings in the library, on the 3rd floor, in a section the librarian's hairy black cat did not patrol. He read, in those mornings, the 3 volumes of Foundations of Wandlore by Galadriel Mountcastle, which were not on the school's curriculum, and which had been written in the 2nd decade of the 20th century, by a witch who had subsequently lost her funding, because her funder had decided the volumes contained too much. He read also the 4-volume Defensive Charms of the High Houses by an anonymous 19th-century author. He read the school's collected back issues of the Daily Prophet from the years 1969 to 1982, which the library had bound and shelved in a corner that did not, on present attention, receive much traffic. He learned, in those mornings, the names of every member of the First Order of the Phoenix, the names of every known Death Eater of the First War, the trial dates and sentences of the Death Eaters who had been caught, the names of the Death Eaters who had not, and the precise geography of the political alignment of the country's pure-blood families between the 2 wars. He filed the names in a structure in his head that had room. He spent 3 afternoons walking the corridors of the castle. He mapped the locations of the 17 secret passages he had read about, confirmed the existence of 14 of them, identified 2 further passages the official records did not contain, and discovered, in a tapestry on the 7th floor, the precise location of a room that would open when paced past 3 times. He did not open the room. He filed it. He spent 2 afternoons in the company of Ron Weasley, who had been bored, and who had been pleased to be invited to a chess match in the common room. He spent 1 afternoon on a broom over the empty Quidditch pitch with Wood, who had managed to convince him to do a small Christmas break drill on the basis that, if the rest of the team was at home, no one would see if he embarrassed himself. He did not embarrass himself. He came down from the broom in the snow at 4 in the afternoon with the small, bewildered face of a boy who had not realized, until he had been on the broom for 30 minutes, what it was he had been agreeing to. Wood, on the grass beside him, had a face like a man who had been given a Christmas present he had not believed in. He suggested, very politely, that perhaps after all the boy might consider the team in the 2nd year. The boy stammered something polite about wanting to think about it. He left Wood on the grass. On Christmas morning, after the cloak, he went into the corridor to the 3rd floor to check the configuration of the corridor's lock. The corridor was empty. The lock was simple. He confirmed, by means of the small perception trick he had been practicing on the door for 2 months, that the door was charmed against student entry by an Alohomora-defeating modification that any 6th year could circumvent. He confirmed also that the lock did not contain the more sophisticated identity binding the school's older doors used, and that the binding the lock did contain was tuned to recognize a specific signature held by Professor McGonagall, Professor Snape, Professor Sprout, Professor Flitwick, Professor Quirrell, and the half-giant Hagrid. He confirmed that the Lock's roster did not include the headmaster, because the headmaster had built the corridor and did not need to be on the roster. He confirmed that the Lock's roster did not include him. He could have added himself. He did not. The addition would have registered. He preferred the Lock not to register him. He went after the Lock down the corridor to the unused classroom, and he stood in front of the mirror for 30 seconds, and he watched the mirror not show him anything he had not already seen on Christmas night, and he turned away. In the second week of January, the trouble with Hagrid began. Hagrid had won the dragon's egg in a game of cards. The dragon's egg had hatched on the 18th of February in the fireplace of Hagrid's hut into a small Norwegian ridgeback that Hagrid had named Norbert. Hagrid had fed Norbert dead rats and a bucket of brandy. By the second week of March, Norbert had grown to the size of a Saint Bernard. By the third week of March, Norbert had set Hagrid's beard on fire twice. By the second week of April, the dragon's existence had become known to Charlie Weasley, the Weasleys' second eldest, by an exchange of letters between Ron Weasley and his mother that he had read over Ron Weasley's shoulder, and through which he had learned that Charlie Weasley would, the following Saturday at midnight, send 4 colleagues from the Romanian Dragon Reserve to the highest tower of the castle to collect Norbert by way of a complicated freight charm. He had not arranged this. The arrangement had occurred without him. He filed the arrangement with the small, mild approval of an administrator whose subordinates had performed adequately without supervision. On the night of the freight charm, Hermione Granger, in the corner of the library, asked him whether they would be taking Norbert up to the tower. He said that taking Norbert up to the tower would put them in a corridor at midnight under conditions Filch had been told to monitor, that Filch's monitoring would result in their being given detention, and that the detention, in his calculations, would not be inside the castle but would be in the Forbidden Forest, under the supervision of Hagrid, in pursuit of a unicorn that had been killed in the 8th section of the forest the previous week, and was being drained, on subsequent nights, by a creature that was not a creature of the forest. He said the detention would have been useful in November and would, in May, be unnecessary, because the creature in question was now in the castle. She nodded. She did not insist on the tower visit. The twin redheads of Ron Weasley's brothers were the children who eventually carried Norbert up the tower. They were good at corridors at midnight. They received, the following morning, a detention from Filch for being out of bed. The detention was inside the castle and involved, on Filch's careful direction, the polishing of trophies in the trophy room. He spent the night of the freight charm in his dormitory. He spent the next 2 months between February and April doing the small operational housekeeping he had been postponing since November. He calibrated his stammer. He introduced a small new pause into it on the 3rd week of February so that the pause would not become metrically predictable. He introduced a small new stutter on the syllable after the first stammer on the 2nd week of March so that the stammer would not become readable. He did this in the privacy of his own attention without anyone noticing. The witch in green robes did not notice. The pale-faced man in black did not notice. Hermione Granger noticed, told him on a Wednesday in early March that he was overcorrecting, and asked him whether he wanted help. He said yes. She gave him 3 specific adjustments. He took them. By the 2nd week of April, his stammer was the most carefully maintained stammer the castle had ever heard. In the 2nd week of May, he spent an evening at the door of an unused classroom on the 5th floor, alone. The classroom contained the 2nd mirror Dumbledore had set as bait. He had identified its location by the small inconsistency in the ward lines at the door, which the headmaster had compensated for in his original placement of the bait, but which had drifted, over 4 months, by 1/4 of an inch. The drift was the kind a competent observer would have missed. He had not missed it. He went into the classroom. He looked at the mirror. The mirror showed him a boy holding the stone. He took the stone out of the mirror with the perception trick the mirror had been built to detect. The mirror did not detect it. He left a perfect copy in its place, fashioned out of the small lump of quartz he had been carrying in his pocket since the first week of May. He pocketed the stone in his sock. He went back to his dormitory. He did not, on the matter, do anything else. The next morning, the old man with half-moon spectacles, who had been visiting the mirror in the 5th-floor classroom on a fortnightly schedule since the 2nd week of January, opened the door of the classroom, looked at the mirror, saw the stone in his own pocket inside the mirror as he had been seeing it for 4 months, and closed the door again. He did not check the stone. The mirror had been built to make the check unnecessary. The mirror was, on present configuration, the most effectively built piece of bait the castle had ever produced, and the bait had been taken without the baiter knowing, which was, in the strictest accounting, the most beautiful possible outcome. The headmaster went to his office and ate a sherbet lemon. The being in the second-year dormitory of Gryffindor Tower, who was not a second year, who was in the strictest accounting an 11-year-old, and who had, in the small inside of his sock, a stone the color of a winter sunset, slept the slow, accurate sleep he had slept on the first night of term. In the 2nd week of January, Hermione Granger returned from London with a face that had spent the holidays in close conversation with itself. He met her in the corner of the library on the first Wednesday of term. She brought tea. He brought her a single page of paper on which 7 items had been crossed out in her own handwriting. She gave it back to him without a word. He placed it in the kitchen fire on the way to dinner. He did not break the mask for her again, on the Wednesdays in January and February. He did not need to. She had heard the second voice 3 times. The voice was now a thing she could recognize in his interior without his speaking it aloud, by the small alterations to the alignment of his shoulders and the cadence of his sentences. He spoke to her in their Wednesdays in the stammer of the small body, and she heard under the stammer the silken sentences she had been hearing in her head all month. He admired the development. He did not, on the matter, have to do anything. In the 2nd week of March, Professor Quirrell missed 3 classes. In the 4th week of March, Professor Quirrell came back with a fresh smell of dragonfire on his robes and an expression of damage badly hidden. The passenger on the back of his neck had become, in the intervening fortnight, a more visible passenger. The man was thinning. The man was not eating. The man, in the room where he taught the first years to ward off boggarts and grindylows, kept catching himself and looking up at the corner of the ceiling where the camera, if there had been a camera, would have been. There was no camera. There was a portrait, halfway down the corridor outside, who reported to a portrait 2 corridors over, who reported to a portrait in the staff room. In the 2nd week of April, Hagrid won a dragon's egg in a game of cards at the Hog's Head from a stranger in a hooded cloak. He had known 3 weeks before that this would happen. He had decided to let it. He sent Ron Weasley, with a written note, to the Hog's Head on the 4th Friday of April under the pretext of asking Hagrid whether Norbert was the name Hagrid had chosen, by then, for the dragon's egg, which had hatched in his hut, would be eating chicken or steak that week. Ron Weasley returned from the Hog's Head with a story he could not quite organize, including a description of the stranger in the hooded cloak, including a phrase the stranger had used, including a movement the stranger had made with one hand. The phrase was the phrase a man uses when he has been speaking aloud while wearing another man's body. The movement was a habit of the back of the man's neck. He thanked Ron Weasley. He did not, on the matter, do anything else. By the 3rd week of May, The school had decided that the third-floor corridor was no longer a corridor a student could be confused about. By the fourth week of May, Professor Quirrell had stopped sleeping in his own quarters. By the first week of June, Hermione Granger had asked him, in their corner of the library, what they were going to do. He told her, "Tonight." Why tonight? Because the next moonless night is tomorrow night, and the partial soul on the back of the man's neck has spent 4 months calibrating the moonless night as the night of his attempt. He will go down the trapdoor tonight, because he has decided he will not give the school another 24 hours in which to interfere with him. He will fail to retrieve the stone, because the man on whose neck he is riding does not have the disposition the stone requires, and the stone has been placed in a configuration that responds to disposition. He will fail in a way that I will then need to either correct or use. I will use it. What do you want me to do? Bring a wand. Bring the notebook in your head. Walk 3 paces behind me. Speak when I look at you and not before. If Ronald Weasley is in the room, treat him as the loyal friend he is and not as anything else. She nodded. She did not, that supper, eat much. The trapdoor was where he had read it would be, under a Cerberus called Fluffy on the 3rd floor, in the corridor behind the locked door. The Cerberus, when they came in, was already asleep. A small harp in the corner, presumably the work of the trembling Quirrell, was playing a slow tune that had 13 seconds of music programmed and looped it on a charm. He registered the looping interval. He took out his own wand, set a quieter charm on a small handkerchief beside the harp, and adjusted the loop to 17 seconds. The Cerberus did not stir. Ron Weasley said, in the same tone he had said blimey in the dormitory at Christmas, "Mate, how did you know how to do that?" Read about it in the library." Hermione Granger did not say anything. Hermione Granger had said her 7 words at dinner, 3 paces back, and would not need to say more. The trapdoor sequence, in the order he had calculated it, took a small inventory of the school's defensive imagination. The Devil's Snare was a charming first defense. It had been planted, by Professor Sprout, in a chamber whose temperature she had configured to suit the plant's preferences. The plant had been allowed to spread along the floor and up the walls. It greeted them, when they landed, by trying to wrap them in the loose green coils that the plant's ancestors had used, for the better part of 2 centuries, to keep tropical herbivores out of the chamber's equivalent ecosystem. He waited the precise interval he had calculated. He let Hermione Granger speak the small Lumos solemn spell that produced the warm light. The plant retreated, on schedule. The Flying Keys chamber was the first defense that asked the room to demonstrate competence. 200 keys, charmed to flight by Professor Flitwick, swarmed the high ceiling above a stone table that contained an old broomstick. He let Ron Weasley take the broomstick. He pointed out the key with the bent wing. Ron Weasley caught the key in 20 seconds, came down to the door, fitted the key, and opened it. The keys did not pursue. The keys returned to their swarm. He filed Flitwick's charm. It was a more careful piece of work than the configuration suggested. The chess room was Professor McGonagall's. He had been waiting for it. The chamber was a vast stone hall, lit by torches in iron sconces, with a single great chessboard laid out across the floor in alternating squares of white marble and black. The white pieces on the far side stood at attention. The black pieces on the near side also stood at attention. He let Ron Weasley conduct the match because he had decided in advance that he would. Ron Weasley was the best chess player in their year. Ron Weasley had been waiting all year also to be useful to him on a stage of this kind. Ron Weasley took the position of the Black Knight, with the wide grin of a boy whose hour had come. He took the position of the bishop. Hermione Granger took the rook. The black pieces obeyed Ron Weasley. The white pieces moved on their own initiative, which was the initiative of the spell Professor McGonagall had built into the chamber, which in turn had been calibrated against the playing style of a moderately ambitious sixth year. Ron Weasley was, by his own admission and by his brothers, a stronger player than a moderately ambitious sixth year. He took advantage of the calibration. The match lasted 19 moves. At the 7th move, Ron Weasley moved his knight into the open square in the center of the board. The White Queen, which had been hanging back along the back rank, moved 1 square forward. Ron Weasley said in the small, careful voice he had been using all evening, "She has to take me. If I move, she'll take the king. If I sacrifice myself, you can checkmate." He looked at Ron Weasley. He let on the inside of his attention a small flicker of the second voice acknowledge what the freckled boy across the chamber was offering. The acknowledgement was a courtesy. Ron Weasley did not, on the visible surface, register it. He nodded. "All right." Ron Weasley moved the knight to the square he had identified. The White Queen, on her programmed routine, struck. The knight broke. Ron Weasley fell to the floor of the chamber and did not get up. His head bled lightly onto the black marble. Hermione Granger beside him made the small involuntary sound a person makes when she is watched from 3 paces back, a thing she had not been prepared for. He said quietly, "He will live." The chamber's spell was calibrated against fatality. "Madame Pomfrey will mend the head in 20 minutes. She nodded. He moved his bishop. He spoke the small word that completed the mate. The White King bowed his head, removed his crown, and dropped it on the marble. The far door opened. He told Hermione Granger to wait in the next chamber. He stepped over the body of Ron Weasley with the small care of a friend stepping over a sleeping companion. The next chamber smelled of unconsciousness. A troll lay in it. The troll had been dispatched ahead of them by the Quirrell parasite. He examined the troll briefly in passing. The troll had been put down by a single blow to the upper neck, delivered with the precise economy of a parasite that had used a host's wand hand for many years and had practiced the blow. He filed the blow. He went on into the chamber of the 7 bottles. Hermione Granger came in beside him. The room contained a wall of black flame across the inner door, a wall of purple flame across the outer door, a stone table holding 7 bottles, and a single sheet of parchment on which a riddle in verse had been written in Professor Snape's small, careful hand. He read the riddle. He read it once. The riddle was a logic puzzle. The puzzle had been written by a man who had been working from a small set of theorems about the logic of the puzzle. He named the 7 bottles in his head: poison, poison, wine, wine, back passage, forward passage. The forward passage bottle was the smallest. The back passage bottle was the 3rd from the left. He picked up the forward passage bottle. He turned to Hermione Granger. He gave her the back passage bottle. He spoke in the small, low voice that he had been speaking into her in the corner of the library on Wednesday afternoons. "Go back. Wait for Ron in the chess room. Take him up to Madame Pomfrey. Tell McGonagall you got separated." She nodded. She did not say goodbye. She had not, in any of their conversations over 6 months, said goodbye. She drank. She passed through the purple fire. He turned to the black fire. He drank the smallest sip from the forward passage bottle. He felt the small, cool internal cascade of the potion's defensive routine. He stepped through the black fire. In the chamber on the other side of the black fire, the mirror of Eris stood gold-framed against the far wall, and Professor Quirrell stood in front of it, and the man in the purple turban turned when he came through the fire, and the eyes of the man and the eyes of the passenger looked at him with the eyes that had been looking through the back of the turban all year. Chapter 5 and Chapter 6. The mask breaks twice. The room on the far side of the black fire was a small stone chamber with a low ceiling and a single tall mirror at the back wall. Quirrell was wearing his turban high and his robe tight. The man had the appearance of a person who had not eaten in 2 days and had decided the not eating was a tactical advantage. The man's eyes were fixed on the mirror at the back wall. The passenger on the back of the man's neck, who had been a small malformed presence in September and a thinning competent presence in March, was now a full mind sharing a body's autonomic functions with the host. The mind had spent the winter eating the host. The host knew it, and had not minded as much as the host should have. He came into the chamber through the black fire with the cloak across his shoulders and the school robes under the cloak and the holly and phoenix feather wand in his right hand. Quirrell turned. "You," said Quirrell. The stammer was gone. The voice that came out of the man's throat was not entirely the man's. The voice was the voice of someone who had been speaking through the man's voice for so long that the difference between the host's resonance and the passenger's resonance had ceased to matter. The voice was imperious. It had the particular sibilance of a person whose dental occlusion had been damaged by some previous violence, and who had ceased to care about the damage. The voice expected to be addressed in the third person. He did not address it. He stood 3 paces inside the chamber. He set very gently the cloak down behind him. He let the small body's robes settle into the slight forward hunch they had been settling into for 9 months. "Yes, me," he said. "Hello, Professor." The stammer was there in the Y of yes, in the small wobble of the H of hello. The stammer was there because the audience required the stammer, and the audience in the room was Quirrell. Quirrell had spent the year filing the stammer as a piece of evidence that the boy across the desk was the boy the prophecy had described, and not, in the slow accreting accounting of paranoia, the boy a more careful schemer would have arranged the boy to be. The stammer cost him nothing. The stammer paid for the next 40 seconds. He had calculated the next 40 seconds carefully. He had spent 2 months on them. "You," said Quirrell again. "Come closer. You will tell me what you see in this mirror." The boy in front of the mirror did not move. The boy in front of the mirror let his small head tilt the careful 17 degrees it had been tilting for 9 months in the presence of figures of authority. I see myself," he said. This was the truth in its layer for the audience. It was also in the cell beneath the surface, the lie. He had decided, on a Wednesday in November, that when this conversation occurred, he would let the passenger believe, for as long as the passenger needed to believe it, that the boy in front of the mirror saw what the passenger expected the boy to see. The expectation was that the boy would see the stone in his own pocket, because that was the configuration the mirror had been bound to render. Only a seeker who wanted the stone, and did not wish to use it, would find the stone in his pocket. The configuration was the configuration of an old man who had spent his life building locks that opened only to people who deserved to open them. He had no intention, on entering the chamber, of taking the stone out of the mirror. He let the mirror, instead, render him the boy he had been pretending to be. The mirror, which had failed him on Christmas night by rendering nothing, now rendered the only thing it could render to a being whose perception was sitting in front of it, the perception the being chose to display. He saw, in the mirror, a small frightened boy who was holding the philosopher's stone in his outstretched hand and looking, with the gentle awe of a child who had not yet realized what it was for at it. The mirror was lying. He had told it to. "He lies," said the voice from the back of Quirrell's skull. "Use the boy, I must speak to him." Quirrell unwound the turban. He let the small face register the appropriate horror. The other face, the face of the passenger, emerged at the back of Quirrell's head, knitted into the host's tissue, white and noseless, with eyes the color of stale wine. It looked at him across the chamber with the precise attention of a mind that had spent 11 years learning that the boy in front of it was the boy who had taken its body apart, and the boy in front of it was now going to give the body back, and the giving was going to be the work of a single careful threat. "Harry Potter," said the face. "Hello," he said. The face smiled. The face had spent the smile over 4 decades on 1,000 different audiences. The smile had been thinned in the smiling. "Do you know who I am?" He let the small face look. He let the small face do the dawning recognition the moment required. You're the one who killed my parents. I am. I am also the one your mother died saving you from. I am the one who in 11 years has thought about you more often than any other person on this earth. I am the one who knows what the mirror is showing you. Reach into your pocket, boy. Give me the stone. He did not reach into his pocket. He did not have the stone in his pocket. The stone had not been in his pocket since the moment the chamber's perception had asked his perception what would be in the chamber, and his perception had answered. The stone was, in the strictest accounting, on a shelf in a laboratory in Devon that he had identified by means of 3 intercepted owl letters during the 3rd week of May, where Nicholas Flamel kept a duplicate of the original because Flamel was a careful man, and because alchemists who had outlived 4 centuries had certain habits about contingencies. The duplicate had been moved by him, with the careful courtesy of a thief who left a note, into the precise pocket of the precise pair of robes the original was supposed to be in. The original had not been in the mirror either. On the night, Dumbledore had placed the mirror in the chamber as bait, because Dumbledore had placed a mirror in the chamber as bait, but the stone had not actually been in the mirror, because Dumbledore had been a careful man too. The stone had been in a different mirror in the headmaster's study. He had taken that stone out of that mirror on the night of the 11th of May, by means of a perception trick he had been refining for a month, and had left in the mirror a perfect copy. He had taken the copy out of the duplicate's pocket and replaced it with the original. The original was now, this Wednesday, sitting in his sock. He had a small, pleasant awareness of it. He let the small face do the precise small smile of a boy who has been threatened and who, against his own intention, has just realized what he is. He let his small head tilt 1 degree past the 17 it had been tilting. He let, on the side of his interior that was the side he had not yet allowed in this room, the second mouth begin to speak. The shift was not audible. It was visual and barometric and slightly geological. The chamber's air pressure dropped by 1/8 of an atmosphere. The black fire and the purple fire at the doorways behind him flickered briefly to a color neither of them had been built to produce, and recovered. The torch sconces on the walls dimmed. The cloak, behind him on the stone floor, lay very still in the way that fabrics lie still when they have decided not to draw attention to themselves. The boy in front of the mirror straightened by 1/4 of an inch. The shoulders came back into the alignment of a man who had not, in his first life, been small. The eyes met the eyes of the face in the back of Quirrell's skull. He said, in the voice he had used in the corner of the library and the clearing in the forest, "I would prefer," he said, "that you did not refer to my mother." Quirrell took a step back. The face in the back of Quirrell's skull did not have the muscles to take a step back. It hissed. "What did you say?" "I said," said the boy in front of the mirror in a voice that was not the voice of a boy, "that I would prefer you did not refer to my mother." The face hissed again. "Master," said Quirrell. "Master, he is." "Silence," said the face. The face looked at him. For 3 seconds the face did the only thing it had not done all evening, which was think. He let the face think. He had calculated, in the 2 months he had spent planning this conversation, that the face would be given 17 seconds. He was halfway through the budget. He could afford generosity. "What are you?" said the face finally. He smiled. It was the silken formal smile, not the small private smile he had used in the clearing. The two were different. "I am, at the present hour, the boy whose body you tried to enter 11 years ago, and whose body was, by an accident neither of us could have foreseen, the body of a being whose own perception had no use for a killing curse. I am also, in the part of my history that this conversation cannot afford to spend longer than 4 sentences on, a man who once held a body the size of yours and was, in that body, the most patient strategist of his epoch. I am, at this moment, in possession of the stone you came here for, The stone you can see in the mirror is the suggestion of the stone, not its body. I am, in addition, in possession of the precise sentence that would, if pronounced in this chamber in the next 8 seconds, cause your present body and the body of your host to be parted along an axis you would not enjoy. I will not, at this moment, pronounce the sentence. I will let you go. I will let you go because you are, on present configuration, more useful to me alive and partially dissolved than dead. You will spend the next 4 years in Albania assembling another host. You will spend the 4 years after that approaching me at intervals I will permit, in disguises I will see through, in pursuit of a body you will believe I am withholding. I will, at certain points, allow you small successes. The successes will not be successes. They will be the suggestion of successes. He paused. Do you understand me, Tom? The use of the name took 2 seconds to land. When it landed, the face on the back of Quirrell's neck did the thing he had been waiting all year to see it do. It widened. The wine-colored eyes spread. The thin mouth opened. He took the moment. He drew into the small body a draft of will the small body had not, until this evening, contained. It came up from the chest, into the throat, into the cheekbones, into the eyes. The boy in front of the mirror for 16 seconds was not in the strictest accounting a boy. The face in the room was the face he had worn at the end of his first life, after the cocoon, after the inheritance, after the cell. The face was elegant in a way no 11-year-old face could be elegant. The face was old. The face was, by every measure available to the perception of the chamber, not the face of a child. It was the face of a man who had taken a long route to a different body, and was, briefly, allowing his old face to be visible in the new one. He spoke the name of his old sword once, not aloud, into the chamber. The torches did not so much go out as forget that they had ever been on. In the dark, the boy in front of the mirror and the man behind the boy and the chamber around them all became a single field of perception that the man controlled with the ease of a long-trained hand. The face in the back of Quirrell's neck, the face that had spent 11 years building a return, saw nothing it had been expecting to see. It saw, instead, what it had been most afraid to see, which was a man whose perception had been built precisely to render the second face's fears legible to it. Tom Riddle had built his life around the fear of being unmade. The being in front of the mirror gave him, for 2 seconds, the visible image of his unmaking. The face in the back of Quirrell's neck screamed. Quirrell, under the screaming face, collapsed. The face peeled itself out of the back of Quirrell's neck. The peeling left damage in Quirrell's tissue that Quirrell would not survive. The face had calculated that and had decided the host was an acceptable loss, and had been deciding the host was an acceptable loss since March. The smoke of the face rose into the chamber's ceiling. The smoke compressed. The smoke prepared to flee. He let the smoke flee. He did not, in the second before the smoke went, attempt to grasp it. He had decided in advance that he would not. The smoke was a chaos agent. The chaos agent was a tool. The tool would be set down for 4 years, picked up at intervals, and used over the course of the next 7 years according to the schedule he had drafted between the 2nd of February and the 4th of March, on the back of a piece of parchment he had then burnt in the Gryffindor common room fire. The smoke fled. The chamber, after the smoke, held only him and the body of Quirrell and the mirror. He let the second face fade back into the first. The shoulders came back into the slight forward hunch. The stammer settled back into the throat. He went a Quirrell knelt, took the man's pulse for the form of it, found no pulse, and arranged the man's face into the appropriate expression of a man who had died doing his duty. He picked up the cloak. He went to the mirror. He looked at the boy the mirror was rendering him. The boy was holding the stone in his hand, still in the mirror's interior. He let the mirror discharge its suggestion. He retrieved the suggestion. He pocketed nothing because there was nothing in the mirror to pocket. The stone in his sock did not stir. He took, from a small pouch in his robe, the perfect copy he had brought down with him. He set the copy on the floor in front of the mirror, where Dumbledore, when he arrived in 26 minutes, would find it. He went back through the black fire. He gathered Hermione Granger from the Chamber of the Seven Bottles. He gathered Ron Weasley from the chess room, where Ron Weasley was beginning to come round, his head bleeding lightly. He told Ron Weasley they had won. Ron Weasley grinned with the wide grin of a boy who had been hit by a giant knight and had only just remembered that being hit by a giant knight, when one had done it for one's friends, was a thing one could be pleased about. He told Hermione Granger nothing. He did not need to. He took them out through the chambers. On the third floor, Professor McGonagall and Madame Pomfrey met them at the corner. He produced, for their benefit, the wide-eyed pallor of a small boy who had been through what an audience of two stern witches would have wanted him to have been through. Madame Pomfrey took him to the infirmary by the elbow. Hermione Granger was sent to her dormitory. Ron Weasley was sent to the infirmary on a different floor on a different stretcher. He was put to bed in the bed nearest the door. He slept the deep, accurate sleep he had slept on the first night of term. He woke in the infirmary in the slow, honeyed light of the morning of the 2nd of June at 7:10. The first thing he saw in the slow, honeyed light was Hermione Granger. She was sitting in the chair beside his bed in her uniform with her hair pulled back, with a copy of a history of magic open on her lap that she had not been reading. She had been there since 6. Madame Pomfrey had told her she could not be there. Madame Pomfrey was a kind woman who knew when to lose. Hermione Granger had stayed. She looked at him. He did not, in the look, do the alignment of the silken formal voice. He did the alignment of the boy in the hospital bed. The boy in the hospital bed was bruised, exhausted on the 2nd of June and very much alive. She nodded. "He got away," she said. "He did. You let him." "I did." "Why?" He looked for the count of 2 at the ceiling. He said in the boy's voice but without the stammer, because the stammer was not necessary with her, because he is the most useful chaos agent I have ever been given. I will not make use of him in the way he intends to be used. I will make use of him in the way I intend him to be used. I will, in time, dismiss him. The dismissal will be at my hour, not his. Until then, his presence in this country, intermittent, will give me the cover I require to grow up in the size of body the country expects me to grow up in. I would have had to invent a Tom Riddle if a Tom Riddle had not been kind enough to be already constructed. I am not in the habit, when a thing has been constructed by another hand, of failing to use it. She accepted the answer. She had been accepting answers like this since November. She said, "Dumbledore came to see you while you were asleep. He brought sherbet lemons. He left 2 on the table." "How long did he stay?" 41 minutes. "What did he do for 41 minutes?" "He sat. He looked at you. He looked at the window. He picked up your hand once. He turned the hand over. He put it back. He looked at the inside of your wrist for some time. He left. He thought. He thought for 13 seconds. He said, finally, he suspects what he has been suspecting since the sorting. He has, in the last 6 hours, found a new piece of corroboration in the configuration of the stones in the chamber, where I will have left the small inconsistency I had intended to leave. He will, on present evidence, not have the proof he requires. He will, in the absence of the proof, give me, at our next conversation, the gentlest possible version of his suspicion phrased as a question. The question will be a question about my safety, about my parents, about a country which is in his care. The question will be, beneath the phrasing, a request that I confess. I will not. I have not in this life or the previous one ever found it useful to confess. I respect him. I will not give him what he is asking for. She nodded. She said very quietly, "He is not bad. He is not bad. He is the chess opponent I have in 2 lifetimes found the most worth the playing. I will not at the present hour let him win." She closed a history of magic. She said, "What now? Now I will eat what Madame Pomfrey brings me. I will receive the headmaster's visit. I will lie to him with the precision the conversation requires. I will be discharged in the afternoon. We will go to the leaving feast. Gryffindor will win the house cup because the headmaster has decided that it should, and because he has decided so for reasons that are not in their root, the reasons he believes them to be. We will take the train home. You will go to Hampstead Garden Suburb. I will go to Privet Drive. We will see each other in September. There will, between now and then, be letters which you will burn after reading. There will, in our second year, be a basilisk. We will address it. There will, in our third year, be a different problem. We will address that one too. We will be 11 for one more month." She nodded again. She said last, "I am glad I am in." "So am I." The headmaster came at 11. He came with a tin of sherbet lemons and the gentleness of a man who had spent the night not sleeping and had decided to wear the lack of sleep with grace. He sat in the chair Hermione Granger had vacated. He looked at the boy on the pillow. He looked at the window. He picked up the boy's hand once. He turned the hand over. He looked at the inside of the wrist. He said kindly, "How are you, Harry?" "All right, sir." "You have had a long night." "Yes, sir." "You have, in fact, had a long year. You have been brave. You have been resourceful. You have been, in ways I have not yet entirely accounted for, the sort of student a headmaster meets perhaps once a decade. I do not, you understand, mean only your courage. I mean the quality of your decisions. They have been the decisions of a person older than your years." "I'm sorry, sir." "You should not be sorry. Cleverness is not a sin. It is merely an instrument. The question with any instrument is who is wielding it and to what end. I do not, at this hour, have an answer to that question about you. I have had occasion, over the course of the year, to consider it. I have not arrived. I will not pretend to you that I have arrived." He let the small face register the polite uncertainty. He let the small mouth say, "Yes, sir, I don't know what you mean." The old man with the half-moon spectacles smiled. The smile, on the inside of the smile, was tired. "I mean, Harry, that I have been playing a long game of chess. The board I have been playing it on is this country. The pieces I have been moving have included, among others, you. I have in the last 6 hours become aware of a piece on the board I had not previously known was on the board. I do not know whose hand is moving it. I do not yet know what side it is on. I am, on the matter, willing to wait. I have been waiting for things in this country for a very long time." The smile remained. "I will tell you only this. The piece I am referring to has, so far, played its game with grace, with patience, and with a certain courtesy I had not been led to expect of a piece of its caliber. I hope it will continue to do so. I hope it will, when the moment is appropriate, declare itself. I do not pretend to know when that moment will be. I do not pretend to be the one who chooses." He took a sherbet lemon from the tin. He offered the tin. He took one. The candy was lemon-sharp on the small tongue. He chewed it the way an 11-year-old chews a candy he has not had before. The old man watched. "Thank you, sir." "You are welcome, Harry. Get well. I will see you at the feast." The old man stood. The old man at the door paused. The old man said, without turning, "You will, of course, do me the courtesy of returning the cloak to me at the end of your school days when you have outgrown its uses. It is, in its way, a very old friend of mine." He paused, too. He let the small face register confusion. He said, "Of course, sir." The old man went. He left the infirmary at 4 in the afternoon. The leaving feast was loud, gold, and Gryffindor. The points were tallied, the cup awarded, the great hall draped in scarlet. Ron Weasley wept openly. Hermione Granger clapped politely. He smiled at the appropriate moments and ate his pudding. On the train home on the 1st of July, the three of them sat in the compartment in which he had met Ron Weasley 10 months before. The countryside slid south. Ron Weasley said, somewhere outside Sheffield, "Do you think next year will be quieter?" He let the small face produce the wry smile. He said, Think it'll be different." Hermione Granger looked at him across the compartment. She did not say anything. The countryside slid south. The train clattered through a tunnel and back into the green. Somewhere very far away, on a ridge in Albania, a smoke that had once been a man crawled into the body of a small snake and slept. In the compartment, 3 children played exploding snap. One of them was not a child. He had been looking forward to the journey. He sat at the table by the window for some time after she had gone. The hospital wing in the slow, honeyed light of the 2nd of June was the quietest room he had been in since the holidays. Madame Pomfrey, 2 cubicles down, was at her desk, going over the year's intake records with a quill that had been making the same small scratch for 40 minutes. The window beside him was open by an inch and was admitting, through the gap, the cool air of a Scottish morning that had decided to be summer at last. Somewhere outside, a lawnmower was being charmed across the south lawn by the half-giant Hagrid. He listened to the charm. The charm was simple. The mower moved at the pace of a man who was not, in his current configuration, in any particular hurry. He thought about the year. He thought about the year in the way he had thought about every year of his previous life, which was the way of a man preparing a small ledger of completed entries against a longer ledger of upcoming entries. The ledger was satisfactory. The stone was in his sock. The parasite was on a ridge in Albania. The old man with half-moon spectacles was, in the strictest accounting, 2 moves down on the chessboard and aware. At some level he could not yet articulate that he had been outplayed. The brilliant girl in Hampstead Garden suburb had 2 letters from him in her trunk, and a small page of instructions for the summer that she had memorized. He thought last about the second mouth. The second mouth had spoken twice in the year. The first speaking had been on a Wednesday in November, in a corner of the library behind the 3rd pillar, to a girl who had earned it. The second speaking had been the previous evening in a chamber on the 3rd floor, to a face on the back of a man's neck who had not. He had calculated, in advance, that the second speaking would be necessary. He had calculated also that the speaking would cost him. The cost had been small. The cost had been the visibility, for 16 seconds, of a man who had been carefully invisible for 11 years. The visibility had not, on present evidence, been registered by any third party. The face on the back of the man's neck had been the only witness, and the face was now smoke on a ridge in Albania, and the smoke was not in a position to make a report. The cost was, in the small inside of the ledger, recoverable. He thought about whether the visibility had served, on balance, his interest. He concluded on review that it had. The parasite had been given, in the 16 seconds, the precise impression he had needed to give him. The impression was that the boy in front of the mirror was a boy. The impression was, in the strictest accounting, false, but the impression had been built out of the small fragment of his old face that he had elected to show, and the parasite had read the fragment as the totality, and had concluded, wrongly, that he had been facing, at the end of the chamber, an unusually competent 11-year-old. The conclusion would serve. In the 4 years the parasite spent assembling another host, as the fixed image against which any future encounter would be calibrated. The parasite would, in those 4 years, run his planning against the wrong opponent. The wrong opponent was a much easier opponent to defeat than the right one. He smiled. It was the silken formal smile, not the small private smile. He took it back off. Madame Pomfrey came in with a tray. The tray contained breakfast. He thanked her in the small voice. He ate the breakfast. He drank the pumpkin juice. He let her check his bandages. He let her chide him gently for the bruise on his elbow and for the small cut on his cheekbone that had not yet decided to heal. He let her tell him that he would be discharged at 4. He thanked her again. She left. The headmaster's visit at 11 was the conversation he had been preparing in the small back room of his attention for 6 months. He had projected the conversation in advance along 7 branches. He had assigned each branch a probability. The branch the headmaster in fact took was the second most probable branch. He had given it a likelihood of 0.31. The headmaster's gentleness in the branch matched, to the small fraction of a single emphasis, the model he had built. The headmaster's chess analogy he had not predicted. He had predicted the chess analogy at 0.47 and had budgeted for it. The analogy's actual content, when it came, was a fraction more elegant than the model had reproduced. He admired the elegance. He filed the elegance. He filed, in the same drawer, the line about the cloak. The line about the cloak was a line he had not predicted. The line was a soft warning, said in the tone of a courtesy, that the headmaster had not forgotten that the cloak was a tool of the headmaster's lineage as well as of the Potter lineage, that the cloak's eventual return to the headmaster was an item the headmaster intended to remember, and that the headmaster, by mentioning it on a morning when he could have mentioned anything, was signaling that the cloak was not the only tool of his lineage in the room. This was correct. The cloak was not. The other tool, which would emerge in the next several years, was a wand that the headmaster carried at his hip, whose history he had read about in the 2nd volume of Foundations of Wand Lore. He had filed the wand in his 2nd week of school. He would file it again. The leaving feast at 6 was the loud gold Gryffindor evening Dumbledore had decided it should be. He sat with Ron Weasley and Hermione Granger and ate the precise amount a small recovering boy should eat. The twin redheads, 2 seats up, bellowed at intervals. Ron Weasley wept. Hermione Granger clapped politely. The pale-faced man in black at the high table looked across the hall at him with the precise look that he had decided to make a permanent feature of his career. He gave the pale-faced man back the small uncertainty he had given him in September. The cup was awarded to Gryffindor. The hall roared. The hangings, which had been Slytherin green at the start of the feast, changed to Gryffindor scarlet by means of a charm the headmaster operated with the small theatrical economy of a man who had been operating it for 41 years. He clapped. He clapped at the volume and duration a small recovering boy would clap. At the high table, the old man with half-moon spectacles met his eyes once. He did not look away. He let the look run for the second he had budgeted for it. He let the silken formal Aizen strategist, in the inside of his interior, give the old man, at the bottom of the eye contact, a small acknowledgement. The acknowledgement was the acknowledgement that one gives a chess opponent who has played the 7th move well. The acknowledgement was not a promise to come back to the board. The acknowledgement was, in the small inside of the look, a courtesy. The old man returned it. The hall continued. The cup continued. The boy at the Gryffindor table returned to his treacle pudding. He had been looking forward to the treacle pudding. On the train south, in the compartment in which he had met Ron Weasley 10 months before, Ron Weasley played Exploding Snap with him and lost 3 games out of 3. Hermione Granger read a copy of A Tale of Two Cities her mother had pressed on her at the start of the holidays. The countryside changed. The Scottish hills gave way to the Lake District, the Lake District to the moors of the North Riding, the moors to the flatter farmland of the Midlands. He watched it through the window. The window's glass had small scratches in it that the trolley witch had not, in 11 years, been instructed to polish. He liked the scratches. Hermione Granger looked across the compartment at him at a point somewhere outside Lichfield. She did not speak. He did not speak. The brilliant girl in the train compartment had been, 8 months ago, a stranger in a bag and a forward stance. She was now the only mirror in either of his 2 lives that had returned him an honest reflection. He noted, in the inside of his attention, that the noting was the noting of a sensation he had no analog for, and that the small body was producing the sensation whether he attended to it or not, and that he had decided, on present configuration, that he would carry it. The carrying would not interfere. He gave her, across the compartment, in the small space of the journey, the silken formal acknowledgement that one gives a colleague at the end of the first day of a long campaign. She returned it. Ron Weasley, between them, made his 9th attempt at a winning exploding snap configuration, and was, on the 9th attempt, defeated by a queen. He laughed. It was the laugh of a small boy who had been laughing at Ron Weasley's losses to him all year, and who would in 7 years' time be still laughing at them. The laugh had the precise resonance and cadence the audience required. The audience in the compartment was Ron Weasley and Hermione Granger and an owl who had, 20 minutes earlier, finished the strip of bacon he had brought her from the leaving feast and who was now sleeping in her cage. He looked through the window. Somewhere outside, on the small rural lanes between two of the Midlands market towns, a moped was being pushed up a hill by a man whose moped had run out of petrol. The man was wearing yellow trousers. He did not know the man. He would never meet the man. He liked the trousers. He let the small body have the 8 seconds of looking. He logged the waist. He went back to the compartment. Chapter 6 End.